Chapter 195, Get It For Me, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Upon hearing that her mother was pardoned, Imperial Princess Liao smiled even more sweetly as she clung onto the Qingping Emperor's arm and giggled. The Qingping Emperor looked at this young daughter of his who he had spoiled since the day she was born. In the blink of an eye, she had already turned 10 and was starting to bloom into a young lady's figure. Looking upon her now, he could only lament as his heart was filled with sadness. When Imperial Princess Liao had been a little younger, he would even carry her in his arms. However, as she grew older, the most affectionate gesture he could give her was simply petting her soft head of hair. Imperial Princess Liao was the Qingping Emperor's youngest daughter. Daughters were meant to be spoiled, while sons were to be raised strictly. Furthermore, there were some other hidden matters that most people wouldn't know about, so the Qingping Emperor didn't mind pampering this youngest daughter of his a little more than usual. Imperial Princess Liao's almond-shaped eyes, a little similar to Chu Lian's own pair, flitted about Tingyu Pavilion once before finally settling on Chu Lian. Hidden by the Emperor's broad sleeves, Imperial Princess Liao's eyes narrowed before returning to their normal, lovable expression. Father, is she the new honored Lady Genie that you blessed with a title? The Qingping Emperor smiled. He wasn't a fool, he knew that his daughter was a little narrow-minded and liked to play some tricks on people she didn't like. For example, he knew that Imperial Princess Liao had definitely met Chu Lian at the Dingyuan estate, and he also knew that that particular encounter hadn't ended well for his daughter. Despite this fact, she was now acting as if today was the first time she was meeting Chu Lian. The Emperor was too lazy to expose her, so he played along. Yes, she is. Why are you asking, Liao? Chu Lian stood where she was and gave an appropriate greeting to Imperial Princess Liao from afar. Her heart sunk a little when she heard Imperial Princess Liao mentioning her on purpose. A grudge had been born between them during their first meeting, and it wasn't going to go away anytime soon. Imperial Princess Liao looked up at the tall and handsome emperor with wide eyes filled with admiration. Using a childish voice, she said, "Father, Yao heard that honored Lady Genie makes some tasty longevity peach buns. Why don't you let her make some for Yao in Yao's palace? Yao is really craving them." The moment Imperial Princess Liao finished speaking, the gentle expression on the emperor's face immediately turned into stormy clouds. Imperial concubine Wei's heart leaped in fright and she tugged Princess Liao towards her, scolding her in a quiet voice. "Yao, the palace has everything you could ever want to eat. Those longevity peach buns are only meant to be eaten during longevity feasts. You're not allowed to eat them otherwise." Imperial Princess Liao had only heard that the emperor was meeting Chu Lian in Tingyu Pavilion. She hadn't paid attention to anything else before rushing straight over, intending to cause some trouble for Chu Lian. Thus, she didn't know anything about what had just occurred here. Those longevity peach buns had been the cause of the emperor's earlier ire. Now that he was reminded of the matter, how could the emperor be in a good mood? Princess Liao had only wanted to cause trouble for Chu Lian somehow. How could she bother to listen to Imperial Concubine Wei's reprimand? She pushed her way out of Imperial Concubine Wei's arms and hugged the emperor's arm again. "Father, didn't you say you love Yao? Why won't you agree to such a small request for Yao? Yao just wants to eat honored Lady Genie's longevity peach buns." Chu Lian fought hard to keep the calm in her expression. This Imperial Princess Liao had really been spoiled beyond hope. The emperor's mood was clearly sinking lower and lower, but the princess still wasn't giving up. Empress Shen looked at Imperial Concubine Wei and her daughter with cold eyes. Her gloom from earlier had completely disappeared. Instead, she now looked down upon Imperial Princess Liao full of disdain. What a narrow-minded girl. Imperial Princess Liao was already used to being spoiled. What she wanted was what she would get. Inside the palace, she was pampered by the emperor and spoiled by the imperial concubine. Even Consort Do would give in to her demands. There wasn't a single time when she hadn't gotten her way. When she saw that the emperor remained silent, tears of frustration rolled down her cheeks in an effort to seek his attention. Father doesn't love Yaoer anymore, sob. The Qingping emperor's mood had been dismal from the very beginning. It had only been alleviated slightly with the entrance of his daughter. But now, that very same daughter was crying, and her incessant cries were like needles piercing his brain. He was the great and mighty sovereign of this country. Even if he was inclined to spoil his children, there needed to be a limit in accordance with his stature. He looked down at his daughter, who seemed to have grown much taller since the last time he had seen her. She was already 10 years old. He had thought that that was still too young, so he had given in to her time and time again. However, now that her personality had been warped to this degree, he could no longer give in to everything she wanted. The Qingping emperor abruptly tossed his sleeves, shaking away the little hands that were clutching onto it. In a low voice, he rebuffed her and said, "Liao, are you finished with this nonsense?" He had never ever reprimanded the princess before, but now he was scolding her in such a cold tone of voice. Liao was shocked by the first scolding she had ever received from the emperor. She stared up at him with wide, disbelieving eyes, as if she couldn't believe that those words had come out of his mouth. After what seemed like an eternity, she asked with a trembling voice, "Father, you're scolding Yaoer?" Just as Imperial Princess Liao was about to say something else, Imperial Concubine Wei covered her mouth in fright. Chapter 196, Get It For Me, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The Qingping emperor tossed his sleeves again with a dark expression. "Liao, I've been far too lenient with you in the past. I allowed you to do whatever you wanted without any limits. Even though Jeannie's rank is low, she is still an honored lady whose name I personally bestowed. How could I have her become a cook for you in your palace? Concubine, if you don't rein Liao in and teach her some proper manners, I'll send her to the Empress to be raised under her name." Empress Shen and Imperial Concubine Wei hadn't expected such a proposal to come from the emperor. Give her to the Empress to raise. How could that be possible? Imperial Princess Liao was already 10 this year. She wasn't a young, unknowing child. How could the Empress possibly raise her to love her as a mother at this age? Empress Shen and Imperial Concubine Wei were both extremely resistant to this action. Imperial Concubine Wei had been injured during childbirth, so Imperial Princess Liao was the only child she would ever have. How could Imperial Concubine Wei possibly be willing to give up her only child to someone else? In her fright, Imperial Concubine Wei's hold over Liao's mouth loosened. Imperial Princess Liao immediately cried out and made a fuss after getting free. "Father, Yaoer doesn't want to go with the Empress. Yaoer doesn't want to leave Mother." "Nonsense. Who gave you the right to address the Empress with such disrespect? Remember, the Empress is your legitimate mother." The Qingping Emperor rubbed his temples in fatigue. "Forget it, I was the one who pampered you to this state. When the mid-autumn banquet ends, Concubine Wei and Liao will be grounded for a month. I'll send senior servant Shi to teach Liao some etiquette and manners by then." After tossing out these orders, the Qingping Emperor left with his entourage, leaving only the sight of his broad back for the rest of the crowd to watch. Imperial Princess Liao couldn't believe that she had failed to teach a lesson to Chu Lian, and had even gotten both herself and her mother grounded. She turned her grudge-filled glare onto Chu Lian. Fortunately, after having suffered such a scolding from the emperor, she had grown some brains and didn't go up to fight with Chu Lian directly. Chu Lian simply cast a sideways glance towards the empress and concubine before Eunuch's son came over to her side and quietly said, "Honored lady, please follow this servant. The emperor has given orders for you to be escorted to the Empress Dowager's palace." Chu Lian nodded and said her thanks before bobbing in goodbye to the Empress. She then followed after Eunuch's son and exited Tingyu Pavilion. Now, there was only Empress Xin, Imperial Concubine Wei, and the shell-shocked Imperial Princess Liao left in the parlor of Tingyu Pavilion. Empress Xin smoothed out some invisible creases on her imperial yellow dress before walking with perfect steps to stand in front of the half-sprawled Imperial Concubine Wei. She looked at her from the corner of her eyes and said, "Little sister Wei, you should consider that lesson you just learned carefully. As much as the Emperor loves you now, that favor is just as easily lost as it was gained." With these ambiguous words as her parting message, Empress Xin led her group of servants out of the hall. Imperial Concubine Wei hugged Imperial Princess Liao to her, biting her bright red lips until she could taste a hint of blood in her mouth. It was only then that she carefully rearranged her expression and turned to look at her daughter. "Yaoer, remember everything that happened today. The day will come when we'll get our revenge for all that we've suffered." It wasn't until she had left Tingyu Pavilion far behind that Chu Lian could finally ease out of her state of tension. When she recalled Imperial Princess Liao's expression before she had left, Chu Lian just knew that the princess wasn't going to let her off that easily. She sighed. Was it just her fate to be a trouble magnet? TL note, Liao calling the Empress by her title, which serves as her name, since no one is allowed to address the Empress with her actual name except the Emperor, is disrespectful according to their customs. The Empress is considered to be the legitimate mother of all the Emperor's children, even if she didn't give birth to them herself. Thus, Liao is supposed to call her Mother Empress or Muhu, while she can only call her own concubine mother by Mother Concubine or Mufei. I shortened this to Mother as it's a bit of a mouthful. To draw a comparison to Western norms, it would be like a child calling their mother by their full name instead of saying Mum. Chapter 197, Get It For Me, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The Imperial Gardens were huge, and it was in the middle of autumn now. Large fields of chrysanthemum flowers were in bloom, coming in all different varieties and colors. From time to time, a few maidservants would pass through, painting quite the lively, bustling scene. The Empress Dowager's Ningyi Palace was quite far from Tingyu Pavilion. Eunuch's son had mentioned this to her as he led the way. However, as they walked down a secluded path through the gardens, Chu Lian didn't feel like it was a long way off at all. There was much to see, and she freely admired the beautiful view of blooming, multicolored chrysanthemums around her. Eunuch's son pointed out a pavilion not too far from them. "Honored lady may rest in that pavilion for a moment." Chu Lian nodded and let Eunuch's son lead them there. This pavilion was also surrounded by chrysanthemum flowers, and the scenery was beautiful. It was indeed a good place to take a short break. Eunuch's son stood off to one side and smiled. "Would honored lady like some tea and refreshments? This servant will fetch some, so honored lady may stay in this pavilion and rest for a moment." Chu Lian saw that Eunuch's son was a nice person, so she smiled and shook her head. "There's no need, Gong Gong. I'm only sitting here for a short while. Grandmother's still waiting for me, so it won't be good to tarry too long." Since Chu Lian had already made her refusal clear, Eunuch's son didn't leave to fetch any refreshments. Chu Lian was actually being careful. The palace wasn't at all like the Jing'an estate. Anyone she bumped into here could be someone with great authority and power. It was better to keep a low profile. She had almost fallen into someone's trap just now, so she wasn't about to risk something else happening. At least her own maidservants were much more considerate. After that trip to Tingyu Pavilion, she was both physically and mentally tired. While looking over the beautiful flowers, she was indeed a little peckish. Eunuch's son had his head lowered as he waited at the side. From the corner of his line of sight, he kept an eye on honored Lady Jeannie. Her unperturbed expression hadn't budged one bit while facing those great personages in Tingyu Pavilion, but now she had a wide grin on her face as she happily took out a small purse from within her wide sleeves and deftly opened it with her slender fingers. The contents of the purse were a little odd. Honored Lady Jeannie quickly took out a golden brown pastry embossed with a fancy pattern of the likes he had never seen before. This pastry was small enough to hold between her two fingers, and she kept a delicate grip on it as her cherry-red lips enclosed around one of the edges. He watched as she took her first bite, and her reaction was near instantaneous. Her wide, watery, almond-shaped eyes closed in enjoyment, forming two mini crescents as she savored her snack. In the next second, the round, fancy pastry had already disappeared into her stomach. Eunuch's son unconsciously gulped a mouthful of saliva. In his heart, he was trying to match that pastry with the confections he had seen in the palace. However, even after going down the long list of confections that the palace served, he still couldn't recall if he had seen anything like what Honored Lady Jeannie had just taken out to eat. The pastry in her hands looked really, really tasty. There was some sort of stuffing inside the crisp pastry skin, too. It looked like egg yolk. Could egg yolks be used to make confections? Then was it sweet or salty? Eunuch's son knew he couldn't continue this line of thought. Otherwise, he would surely be unable to resist the urge, and would snatch that little purse of snacks right out of Honored Lady Jeannie's hands. Eunuch's son's head lowered even further. He didn't want to continue watching Chu Lian's blissful expression as she ate those snacks. Sob, sob, sob. No wonder the honored lady hadn't wanted him to fetch refreshments and tea. She had brought her own. Blinded by the delicious food, Eunuch's son forgot that it wasn't normal for noble ladies to bring their own snacks when entering the palace. This wasn't a trip to the wilderness, after all. It was clear that Honored Lady Jeannie was a strange exception to the rule. Chu Lian took out a thin strip of air-dried beef jerky and stuffed it into her mouth. This was a new flavor of beef jerky she had made. It was spicy and helped increase her appetite. She wondered if that fellow He Changdi could eat spicy food. Not too far away, the Qingping Emperor stood at the corner of a corridor. Next to him was his personal senior eunuch, Eunuch Wei. From this angle, the Qingping Emperor could see Chu Lian enjoying some sort of snack sitting in the pavilion a distance away. Sunlight happened to be streaming down upon her, lighting up her tiny face and completely exposing her extremely blissful expression to the Emperor's gaze. The Emperor couldn't help but wonder, what is that girl eating? Is it really that tasty? Thus, in the next moment, Eunuch Wei heard the Emperor order, "Go and retrieve that girl's purse for me." Eunuch Wei's eye twitched. For a second, he thought he was hallucinating, and it was purely his imagination that the great and wise Emperor had said such an odd thing. Had the Emperor, their high and mighty ruler, really just ordered him to snatch some snacks from an honored lady? TL note: imagine a cool stone pavilion surrounded by blooming chrysanthemums, bright colors, cool breeze, and the smell of the flowers, multicolored chrysanthemums pavilion in a garden. Chapter 199, A Purse of Snacks. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. When the Emperor saw that Eunuch Wei hadn't moved, he shot an icy glare at him. Eunuch Wei didn't dare to disobey orders, so he obediently went on his way, despite his troubled expression. Chu Lian was in the middle of eating her second mini mooncake when she heard Eunuch's son greeting someone. Curious, Chu Lian turned around, only to see that there was now another middle-aged eunuch standing behind her, holding a horsetail whisk in his arms. Eunuch's son smiled as he introduced the newly arrived eunuch to Chu Lian. Honored lady, this is the chief steward of the imperial palace, Eunuch Wei. He serves by the emperor's side. Chu Lian smiled and nodded, greeting him cheerfully with a Chief Steward Wei. Chief Steward Wei bowed towards Chu Lian respectfully. His eyes swept over the purse she was holding in her hands, and upon seeing its quickly depleting state, he couldn't help but inwardly beg, "My dear ancestor, please eat a little slower, the emperor is still waiting for those snacks." Honored lady really knows how to enjoy life. This Mixiang pavilion is the best place to admire flowers in the entire imperial gardens. Just a few days ago, the Empress Dowager even mentioned that the best thing to do during the middle of autumn is admire the chrysanthemums while enjoying some round cakes. Chu Lian found this whole meeting rather strange. This eunuch Wei should be a very busy person, judging from his job title. How could he have the spare time to stand here and make small talk with her? When she saw that eunuch Wei seemed to want to continue chatting, Chu Lian could only play along. "Chief Steward Wei, you're overestimating me. I just happened to be passing by and stopped to eat a few snacks since I was feeling hungry." Chu Lian looked down at the snack purse she was holding and continued, "These aren't round cakes, by the way. They're just some snacks I made for myself." "Oh." This servant has long heard that honored lady's heart is as good and pure as an orchid. This servant didn't think that honored lady would also know how to make her own confections. This servant wonders if there might be a chance to taste honored lady's cooking. When those words left eunuch Wei's mouth, even he couldn't hold back the slight, embarrassed flush on his cheeks. But no matter how awkward this was, he couldn't disobey the emperor's orders. Chu Lian was stunned. What? A high-ranked eunuch she had never met before, the chief steward of the palace, at that, was asking her for her snacks? With Chu Lian's baffled gaze focused on him, eunuch Wei awkwardly received the snack purse. Following that, he gave her a deep, low bow, and then, he ran off, at light speed. Only Chu Lian was left standing in the pavilion, her hand still outstretched as she said to thin air, "Eunuch Wei." "My purse." Unfortunately, eunuch Wei was already long gone by now. Chu Lian's expression was cloudy. She turned to ask the frozen eunuch's son, "Eunuch's son, is the food in the palace that bad? Otherwise, why would the chief steward have stolen her snacks and run away?" The corners of eunuch's son's lips twitched. In the end, he could only let honored Lady Jeannie continue believing her own conclusions. After all, he worked under eunuch Wei. How could he dare to cast suspicion on eunuch Wei's conduct? Though, within the privacy of his mind, he was also severely perplexed by this series of events. Eunuch Wei was one of the emperor's trusted servants. He could eat the best bird's nest and the best abalone every day if he wanted to. How could he have come to covet a young girl's snacks, and then just steal them away like that? Had the sun risen from the west today? But eunuch Wei was already long gone, and it was just one small purse with a couple snacks in it. There was nothing special about it, so Chu Lian didn't pursue the matter further. She was about to rest for a moment longer before going over to the Empress Dowager's palace to look for matriarchy, but Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly came striding over from not too far away. When Royal Princess Duanjia reached Chu Lian's side, she pulled her up without waiting for Chu Lian to give her a bow and greeting. "I heard from the Empress Dowager that you were over here in the Imperial Gardens when I entered the palace, so I came over to find you. I didn't think I would bump into you at Mixiang Pavilion." Chapter 199, A Purse of Snacks, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian hadn't seen Royal Princess Duanjia for quite a few days, so it was a pleasant surprise to run into her here. She was about to speak when she noticed Royal Princess Duanjia looking her up and down with a measuring gaze. Finally, the princess's gaze landed on the remains of the half-eaten mooncake in her left hand. The princess blinked and asked, "Chu Lu, what are you eating?" The moment she heard that, Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She held up the remaining mooncake in her hand and replied honestly, "This is a type of snack I made earlier. It's called mooncake." "Mooncake. It sounds really tasty." "Chu Lu, how could you bring snacks into the palace? Why didn't you bring some for me, too? Royal Princess Duanjia's cheeks puffed up as she questioned her friend. Chu Lian replied very intelligently with an "ugh." She really didn't know how to deal with Royal Princess Duanjia. Suddenly, Royal Princess Duanjia held out an open palm in front of her face. Chu Lian stared at Princess Duanjia's face in befuddlement before looking at her open palm. Princess, what are you blanking out for? Hand over all your food. Chu Lian. Princess, you were a little too late. I just finished everything, there's only this half left. Chu Lian pressed a hand against her forehead. Why were the people around her such gluttons for food? It was just a simple snack, so why were there waves of people trying to snatch it away from her? Did they really have to be this way? Royal Princess Duanjia thought for a moment before harumphing in her uniquely tsundere manner. Well, if you've only got that half left, then so be it. I just want a small taste first. You'll make more for me later anyway, right? Chu Lian stared at her. This half was only a half because she'd eaten the rest already. Her saliva was already on it. In the end, Chu Lian didn't have any other choice but to hand it over. If Royal Princess Duanjia would like more, there's still one more box of it that my maidservants are carrying. Royal Princess Duanjia tossed the piece of mooncake into her mouth without any hesitation. She chewed it for a bit before her eyes lit up. Chu Lu, this mooncake is a lot tastier than those round cakes. Eunuch Sun's eyes were twitching when he saw the normally calm, cool, and collected Royal Princess Duanjia was acting like a naive, haughty child. The two girls sat in Mixiang Pavilion for a while longer. However, because Chu Lian was afraid that more strange people would pop out of the bushes, she dragged Royal Princess Duanjia off to the Empress Dowager's Ningyi Palace before long. At a corner hidden out of sight from Mixiang Pavilion, Eunuch Wei stood before the emperor. He offered the purse he took from Chu Lian to the emperor with both hands, and the emperor, in turn, received it. The purse itself was light in color, and there was some oil paper sewn inside of it. On the outside, the embroidery was fairly elaborate, but it wasn't anything special. It looked just like a simple snack purse that any noble would prepare for their children. The emperor opened the little purse and looked inside, only to see the last remaining pastry within. It was about half the size of an egg and circular in shape, and its maker had imprinted the word fortune on top of it. Overall, it looked delightful and well made. The emperor took it out and had a taste. His deep eyes squinted. The stuffing inside was actually quite salty. When he took a closer look, he discovered that the stuffing was made of salty egg yolk. It seemed that that girl did possess some talent in the culinary arts after all. Eunuch Wei stood behind the Qingping emperor, sweating a little. If honored Lady Jeannie hadn't already been married off to House Jing'an's third son, he would have thought that their emperor's heart had been moved by the honored lady. This pastry is quite good. Since Jeannie was able to make it, then it's not strange that she could have made better longevity peach buns than Mr. Wang. It is exactly as the emperor says. Honored Lady Jeannie seems a little different from most noble ladies. The Qingping emperor finished the mooncake in just 2 or 3 bites. He seemed to have recalled something, as he burst into laughter and said, "She is indeed a little different from most. She's much braver than the average noble lady as well." The corners of Eunuch Wei's mouth twitched. Wasn't that just so? If it had been any other lady who had found a disgusting, black, wriggling worm inside of a fresh peach, they would have surely screamed in fright. However, honored Lady Jeannie had the guts to pick out that disgusting worm and instead used it to scare the person who had tried to prank her instead. However, when he thought back to how Imperial concubine Wei and her handmaid had tried to trick Jeannie into losing composure before the emperor, Eunuch Wei thought that honored Lady Jeannie's actions had really made for quite the satisfying end. Chapter 200, A Purse of Snacks, 3. this chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Meanwhile, Chu Lian finally arrived at the Empress Dowager's Ningyi Palace, together with Royal Princess Duanjia. At this time, Ningyi Palace was in a flurry. Most of the female imperial relatives had already arrived. Since she had been delayed for quite some time in the imperial gardens, Chu Lian didn't have the chance to meet the Empress Dowager personally. Instead, it was Princess Wei who pulled her to one side and helped her, giving her instructions on the necessary etiquette for today's event. Chu Lian had come into the palace today dressed as an honored lady, so her maidservants had not given her a married noble madam's hairstyle as usual. When Princess Wei had seen her daughter Duanjia standing together with Chu Lian, their similar figures made them look like a pretty pair of sisters from behind. Princess Wei smiled and patted Chu Lian's fair, tender hand. Matriarch He and old Duchess Xing have gone to accompany the Empress Dowager. In a few moments, just follow behind me with Duanjia. After the meal, all the titled noble madams will be allowed to enter the palace for the banquet. It was clear that Princess Wei was being kind to Chu Lian. Of course, Chu Lian had sensed it for herself. She immediately gave a genuine smile and agreed. After having her afternoon meal with the various female members of the imperial family, Chu Lian and Duanjia sat in the corner of a side hall and sipped some honey water to help with digestion. They also watched as some palace servants led a few noble madams in to pay their respects to the Empress Dowager. This was the first time Chu Lian had seen such a grand event, so she couldn't resist observing everything. Royal Princess, why are all the madams carrying a container of food? Chu Lian asked curiously. Royal Princess Duanjia set down the teacup in her hands and cast a strange look at her. She was clearly surprised as she exclaimed, "You don't know?" Chu Lian shook her head, puzzled. She really didn't know anything about that at all. In the original novel, or at least the part she had read, Chu Lian had never attended any event as grand as this in the palace. Royal Princess Duanjia rolled her eyes at Chu Lian, speechless with her. Your mind must be completely used up for thinking about food. How could you not know about something this simple? Those madams are carrying round cakes in those boxes. After Royal Princess Duanjia's explanation, it was only then that Chu Lian found out that there was traditionally a round cake competition held inside the palace during the mid-autumn banquet, ever since the time of the emperor's great-grandfather. Every noble madam who came to pay their respects to the Empress Dowager or the Empress would bring some round cakes prepared in their own estates, representing their house. The palace servants would place each set of round cakes on an offering table. When the banquet ended, everyone would choose the most delicious round cake, and there would be a prize for the winning house. This was also the current Empress Dowager's favorite part of the Mid-Autumn Festival. Chu Lian found it a little funny. She hadn't expected that there would be such an interesting event during the palace's Mid-Autumn banquet. Which house won the competition last year? Chu Lian asked. Royal Princess Duanjia sipped some tea before throwing a sideways glance at her. The Pan Estate. The Pan Estate. Pan Galao's estate. A trace of suspicion showed up on Chu Lian's face. Royal Princess Duanjia had been watching her expression. She chuckled once and said, Chu Lu, you're pretty sharp. Let me tell you, it wasn't just last year, 2 years ago, or even the year before that. The Pan Estate has always been the champion of the Mid-Autumn banquet. Chu Lian's eyes widened a little. The inklings of something were coming together in her mind. Royal Princess Duanjia didn't try to disrupt her thoughts. She continued on to explain, last year, Madame Pan presented a plate of hazelnut-flavored round cakes. The princess then reached out to point at a distance away. There, see that person dressed in a purple overcoat? That's Madame Pan. Following the direction that Royal Princess Duanjia was pointing in, Chu Lian saw a round-faced middle-aged madam with slender brows. Her face was fair and her lips a little thick. When she smiled, she revealed 8 pearly white teeth, and when she was speaking with others, she always carried a slight smile on her lips, giving everyone a good impression of her. Chu Lian couldn't help but remember the day she had gone to Gillen restaurant and chanced upon the sight of her father in front of the Pan Estate's entrance. Just as Chu Lian was about to sink into her thoughts, she suddenly heard a voice filled with mockery call out in their direction. Chapter 201, Offering Round Cakes. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Dear cousin, you've become rather capable, haven't you? You're actually keeping company with someone like that. Chu Lian was pulled back to reality by that young and angry voice. When she focused her gaze on the source, she saw Imperial Princess Liao standing not too far from them. The 2 ladies standing behind her were the same ones she had seen at the Dingyuan estate the last time, House Dingyuan's 5th Miss, Zhu Yuanqin, and feudal Princess Anmin. One of Chu Lian's eyebrows raised up and she was about to speak, but Royal Princess Duanjia had already started retorting, Liao, when has it been up to you to manage my business? If you're that free, why don't you mind your own? On the way to Ningyi Palace, Chu Lian had already told Royal Princess Duanjia about everything that had happened at Tingyu Pavilion. Duanjia knew about Princess Liao's grounding. Imperial Princess Liao was actually a rank higher than Royal Princess Duanjia. However, Prince Wei and the Qingping Emperor were blood brothers, and the Emperor favored Prince Wei. Since Royal Princess Duanjia was Prince Wei's only daughter, she held favor with both the Empress Dowager and the Emperor. She wasn't any less favored than Imperial Princess Liao. Imperial Princess Liao had always maintained a cordial relationship with her cousin, the equally pampered Royal Princess Duanjia. However, who could have expected Royal Princess Duanjia to side with Chu Lian? Liao's face had turned white from rage in an instant. She couldn't win over Royal Princess Duanjia, but was she really going to lose to a measly honored lady like Chu Lian? What was strange was that Imperial Princess Liao didn't say anything in retaliation to Royal Princess Duanjia's retort. Conversely, she actually held back her anger and only led her entourage away. At the same time, she glared fiercely at Chu Lian and showed an evil smirk. Chu Lian's brows drew together. That smirk gave her an uncomfortable feeling. Royal Princess Duanjia saw that Chu Lian didn't seem too happy, so she tried to reassure her in her own clumsy way. Chu Lu, you don't have to care about that sort of person. She's just throwing a tantrum because she's used to being spoiled. Who knows when she'll be able to grow some brains. Chu Lian managed to pull out a smile for the princess, but her right eyelid kept twitching for some reason. After about 10 minutes, Matriarchy's handmaid, Mu Xiang, came rushing over from somewhere. Her face was extremely troubled. When she saw Chu Lian, it was as if she had seen salvation. Chu Lian looked over, but before she could ask what had happened, Mu Xiang had already spoken first. Third young madam, something bad happened. The matriarch requests for you to go to her. Chu Lian's brows were raised high. She kept feeling that this had something to do with Imperial Princess Liao. Seeing that Chu Lian was going to leave in a hurry, Royal Princess Duanjia frowned and questioned her. Chu Lu, what's wrong? Chu Lian suppressed the anxiety in her heart. Royal Princess, my grandmother is looking for me. I have to go first. Do you want me to come along with you? Chu Lian shook her head. Royal Princess Duanjia didn't press the matter. After watching Chu Lian leave with that handmaid, she moved to another wing of the side hall. Princess Wei seemed to have noticed the commotion. She sent someone to look for Royal Princess Duanjia, who then personally went to meet Princess Wei. It seems like something has happened to House Jing'an. Chu Lu was called over by matriarchy. Princess Wei gripped one of her handkerchiefs and thought for a moment, before instructing one of her senior servants. Send someone to take a look. If there's really something that can't be resolved, report back to me. Chu Lian was taken to another wing of the side hall by Muxiang. She went further in as Muxiang turned back to shut the doors tight. As expected, she saw Matriarch He sitting by the table in the room with Madame Zhou standing next to her respectfully. Muxiang led Chu Lian over to Matriarch He, only to see Matriarch He slam her cane on the ground and shout with anger, "Dalong's wife. What is going on here? How could you have lost our round cakes?" Madame Zhou lowered her head, face pale as she replied the matriarch with a trembling voice. "Grandmother, when granddaughter-in-law left the estate, granddaughter-in-law checked through everything personally. When granddaughter-in-law entered the palace, those round cakes were still there. They only disappeared once granddaughter-in-law entered Ningyi Palace. Granddaughter-in-law really doesn't know where they went." Matriarch He banged her cane on the floor again, controlling the urge to hit Madame Zhou with the cane. "Dalong's wife, tell me. When you entered the palace, who was holding on to that box of round cakes?" Although the palace was hosting a mid-autumn banquet today, the noble madams of each estate were not allowed to bring just anyone with them. Someone of Madame Zhou's rank was only allowed to bring in 2 servants at most. She had brought her most trusted senior servant and handmaid, senior servant Xiao and Jin Shui. This whole matter was extremely suspicious, so Madame Zhou didn't dare to hide anything. However, she also wanted to protect her own servants. After mumbling for a bit, she didn't say anything concrete. Chu Lian was starting to frown while watching from the side. "Madame Zhou, look at what has happened. Are you not going to answer me? Are you trying to bring down our entire family?" Matriarch He was usually amiable and she rarely lost her temper like this. Years of accumulated stress poured out at once, even scaring Chu Lian, let alone the guilty Madame Zhou. "Grandmother, please calm down. Granddaughter-in-law will say it." It was granddaughter-in-law's Jin Shui. Once Madame Zhou finished speaking, senior servant Zhou who served Matriarch He immediately shouted, "What a daring servant. Even after committing a crime, you're still refusing to admit to it. Kneel down at once." Jin Shui was already afraid since she had lost the estate's round cakes. Now that she was being shouted at by senior servant Zhou, her legs turned to jelly and she collapsed on the ground. She tried and failed to support herself with her trembling arms a few times before she finally managed to crawl over to Matriarch He. Matriarch, please have mercy on this servant. This servant didn't lose the box on purpose. This servant was holding on to the box carefully and following eldest young madam into Ningyi Palace. When this servant was turning a corner, a eunuch suddenly pushed this servant. This servant smelled something strange and immediately fainted. When this servant came to, the box was gone. That eunuch had also disappeared. Matriarch, this servant, has been caught in someone else's schemes. Chapter 202, Offering Round Cakes, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian's brows furrowed together. In these circumstances, this Jin Shui probably wasn't lying. She was Madame Zhou's trusted handmaid. Madame Zhou wouldn't be so silly as to shoot herself in the foot. If it wasn't Madame Zhou, then it had to be someone else. When Chu Lian thought of that strange smirk that Imperial Princess Liao had sent her earlier, she felt completely helpless inside. When Madame Zhou saw that the matriarch's gloomy expression had not changed one bit, she pleaded, "Grandmother, please don't blame Jin Shui. It was someone else who stole the box from her." Matriarch He was so angry she almost took up her cane to start bashing Madame Zhou. "Do you know what time it is? If you still have the mood to plead mercy for her, then use your brains to think of a way past this problem." Matriarch He held onto her cane with both hands, chest heaving with the force of her frustration. She turned her head away from Madame Zhou. Madame Zhou's body also turned to jelly. How could she have expected such a thing to happen? If their house didn't offer up any round cakes, they would be taken to blame by the Empress and Empress Dowager. Senior servant Zhou started fretting to one side. Matriarch, could we borrow some round cakes from other madams to substitute for our offering? How could we borrow any? Most of the houses have already offered up their round cakes by now. Who will we borrow from? Furthermore, every estate has their own unique round cakes. How can we borrow any? Since someone was trying to teach their house Jingyan a lesson from the shadows, that meant that someone was definitely watching them. If they really were to borrow someone's round cakes, then they would definitely be exposed the moment they offered the round cakes up. By then, not only would it be a disgrace to their house, it would also be a crime of deceiving the emperor. When senior servant Zhou heard the matriarch's reply, she lapsed into silence. Chu Lian was almost frowning by now. This was a tough problem to resolve. Each estate had already prepared their share of round cakes. Borrowing someone else's wasn't a good solution. When Matriarch He saw that Sanlang's wife was standing to one side, she was about to ask if Chu Lian had any ideas, when Madame Zhou hurriedly said, "Grandmother, sister-in-law knows how to make all sorts of confections. Why don't we let her make some round cakes from scratch? It shouldn't be too hard." When she finished speaking, both Chu Lian and Matriarchy were frowning. Make them from scratch? Ha! Wasn't Madame Zhou overestimating her? Ignoring the fact that there wasn't any place for her to make confections in Ningyi Palace, even if there was one, she had never made these special mid-autumn festival round cakes before. If they didn't turn out well, wouldn't she be the one carrying all the blame and disgrace? It didn't matter if Madame Zhou was simply too confident towards her abilities or if Madame Zhou was trying to drag her down into hot water. Madame Zhou clearly didn't care for her well-being in the slightest. However, no matter what Madame Zhou thought of her in private, Chu Lian was indeed Matriarch He and House Jingyan's last hope at this moment. Even Matriarch He held a shred of expectation in her eyes when she looked at Chu Lian. "Sanlang's wife, do you have any ideas to deal with this emergency?" Chu Lian shot a look at Madame Zhou. Her watery eyes made Madame Zhou feel slightly ashamed. She turned her gaze back to the matriarch and thought for a bit. She took in a deep breath and said, "Grandmother, granddaughter-in-law has thought of a solution. However, granddaughter-in-law doesn't know if it would be appropriate. As much as she didn't want to take on the responsibility for this disaster, she was already part of House Jingyan now. Their names were bound together for better or for worse. Even if she wanted to take care of Madame Zhou, she couldn't risk it with this matter at hand." When Matriarch He heard Chu Lian's words, she seemed to relax. She pulled Chu Lian's hands into her own and massaged them. "Good child, grandmother has let you suffer a fright. Quick, tell grandmother what your idea is." Chu Lian quickly explained her idea, but left the final decision in Matriarchy's hands. "Grandmother, would this solution be appropriate?" Light flickered in Matriarchy's astute eyes. For some strange reason, she just trusted this young granddaughter-in-law of hers. The matriarch patted Chu Lian's hands. "All right, we'll do as you say." Chu Lian didn't relax. She only turned to instruct Xian, who had followed her in, to make her preparations. When she had reached Ningyi Palace, she had also brought Xian and senior servant Gui with her. After Matriarch He gave some instructions to Chu Lian, she ordered Madame Zhou, whose head was still lowered, in a cold, unforgiving tone. "Madame Zhou, you won't be needed when it's time to offer up the round cakes later. Sanlang's wife will take your place. Keep your servants close with you and stand behind me when the time comes. No one is allowed to leave before the banquet is over." This time, Matriarch He was truly angry. At a grand banquet like this, it was customary for the noble madam in charge of the household to be the one presenting their offerings to the Empress Dowager and Empress. However, the matriarch had taken away that privilege of hers. This was a huge slap in her face. Following this, Madame Zhou would not be able to hold her head high in the capital for some time. This punishment was even more harsh than sending away her 2 trusted servants. Chapter 203, Winner 1. When Matriarchy came out of the side hall with Chu Lian supporting her at one side, a handmaid who had been watching from the shadows quietly left. Matriarchy was walking with her 2 granddaughters-in-law behind her, when Lady Pan caught sight of them. She came over with a friendly smile and walked up to Matriarchy's side, bobbing in greeting. Patriarchy was about to return the greeting, but was held up by Lady Pan. Matriarchy, you're already at a grand age, please don't stand on ceremony with me. I don't see Countess Jing'an with you today, how is her health now? Matriarchy's expression didn't change, as if they hadn't panicked over losing their round cakes earlier. With a calm expression, she replied in an amiable manner, I thank you for your kind thoughts in place of my daughter-in-law, Lady Pan. Her body is still a little weak, so she sent a reply to the palace a few days ago, explaining that she can't make it for the banquet. Lady Pan's gaze casually passed over the 2 ladies standing behind Matriarchy, before focusing on Chu Lian's young and tender face. Her smile became even warmer. This lady behind you must be your newest granddaughter-in-law. She is. Sanlang's wife may be young, but she's very sensible. Following Matriarchy's words, Chu Lian bobbed in greeting to Lady Pan. The smile on Lady Pan's face hadn't budged an inch. What great fortune you have, Matriarchy. Your granddaughter-in-law is a sensible one, and she's also a lady from Housing. It won't be too long before you'll get to play with your great-grandson then. Lady Pan's sudden change of topic made the expressions of each of the 3 madams of House Jing'an change. Speaking of the fertility of the ladies of Housing was a slight to Chu Lian. Mentioning a great-grandson was to provoke Madame Zhou, who hadn't produced an heir for the family line yet. Saying that it wouldn't be too long was slapping Chu Lian and Matriarchy in the face. In the entire capital, who didn't know of the news that House Jing'an's He Sanlang had entered the army just 3 days after his marriage? Without her husband at home, what did it mean if the wife was suddenly pregnant? This Lady Pan, who seemingly hadn't done any wrong on the surface, was actually a master of provocation. Matriarchy was more experienced in the end. After a spark of rage had passed through her eyes, she quickly regained her calm. Lady Pan, you're usually closed up in your estate. You probably don't know that that unfilial grandson of mine has already left to join the army at the northern border. Shock appeared on Lady Pan's face and she quickly tried to apologize. Matriarchy, it was my bad for that slip of the tongue. I hope you don't blame me. Who could have expected He Sanlang to be so resolute in leaving? Unless, her gaze shot towards Chu Lian, harboring bad intentions as she hinted at some unspeakable reason. After they had spoken for so long, some of the madams around them were starting to shoot casual glances over. Although nothing showed on their faces, their ears were pricked up to the maximum, trying to catch every word of Matriarchy and Lady Pan's conversation. Their eyes shone like vultures, seeking gossip. Lady Pan was trying to put the blame for He Changdi's leaving on this newlywed wife of his. Although she hadn't finished her sentence, anyone with some brains could tell what she was trying to get at. Madame Zhou lowered her head. Although Lady Pan was provoking House Jing'an right now, she didn't feel anger at all. Conversely, she felt delighted. Lady Pan happened to cross gazes with Chu Lian and was abruptly stunned by what she saw. Chu Lian's wide, clear eyes were looking right back at her without any hint of anger, as if she wasn't the subject of her provocation at all. What Lady Pan had done was akin to tossing a bucket of icy water on a bamboo basket. The icy water hadn't affected the basket one bit and had actually passed through the seams of the bamboo basket, making Lady Pan feel like she had failed in her attack. The two-faced Lady Pan hadn't made Chu Lian angry, but had conversely suffered some frustration herself. She stared at Chu Lian as she continued speaking, now that San Lang has joined the army at the northern border, if he doesn't accrue some sort of achievement, he'll only be able to return in 5 years. What a waste of honored Lady Jeannie's best years. Chu Lien found all this rather funny inwardly. What was going on? Why was everyone targeting her? This was the first time she had ever met Lady Pan. The Pan estate was also ranks above her, so she couldn't possibly have met with them before marriage either. Why was Lady Pan suddenly at odds with her? Could it be because of Chu Qijing's visit to the Pan estate? When she thought of this, Chu Lien's expression turned dark. She didn't ask for her father's love, but he shouldn't be dragging her down either. Many thanks for Lady Pan's kind thoughts. My husband is extremely fortunate, so he'll surely have a lucky turn of events. Chu Lien threw her neutral reply back at Lady Pan. She was too lazy to beat around the bush with this Lady Pan and couldn't be bothered to form a more politically correct response. That Lady Pan was already trying to bully her, wasn't she allowed to throw something back? Chu Lien wasn't someone who liked to hold grudges. She would rather give as good as she got on the spot. Lady Pan choked on that response. That everlasting smile on her face also disappeared slowly. She tossed one last sentence at Chu Lien coldly. I didn't expect honored Lady Jeannie to be so open-minded. Chu Lien tilted her head to one side and gave a dazzlingly bright smile to Lady Pan. Lady Pan's tempo had been completely messed up by Chu Lien's unexpected reply. She suddenly gave a furtive smile. Matriarch He, I haven't seen your estate's round cakes. What's going on? Are you trying to deceive the Empress Dowager? Matriarch He sent a look at Chu Lien, who held up an exquisite container and showed it off to Lady Pan. Thank you for reminding me of the round cakes, Lady Pan. I have to present them now, please excuse me. After she said so, Chu Lien took the round cakes and her maidservants with her to greet the Empress Dowager. Chapter 204, Winner, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Lady Pan stared after Chu Lien's figure in disbelief for a moment. After she regained her senses, Chu Lien had already disappeared into the crowd. Her good mood had been completely dissipated by this short conversation with them. In her frustration, she shot a look of contempt at Madame Zhou before she left, not forgetting one last provocation. When the madams around them saw that it wasn't House Jingyin's eldest young madam who was to present the round cakes, there were a bunch of strange looks directed towards Madame Zhou. In an instant, Madame Zhou felt the urge to dig a hole and hide in it. By the time Chu Lien had properly presented her round cakes and returned to Matriarchy's side, Royal Princess Duanjia had squeezed in beside her. She whispered in Chu Lien's ear and asked if she needed any help. Chu Lien smiled and shook her head, telling her that everything was fine. Royal Princess Duanjia's expression relaxed and she gave her a nod before leaving. The banquet was about to begin and the round cakes would be judged at the end. Royal Princess Duanjia was part of Prince Wei's estate, so she wasn't going to be seated with Chu Lien's group. By the time all the female guests were seated, the banquet officially started. Royal Princess Duanjia was sitting with Princess Wei at one of the foremost seats. Right above her were the Empress Dowager and the Empress. Imperial concubine Wei was seated below the Empress, while a few old concubines of the previous emperor were seated below the Empress Dowager. Princess Wei was ranked below the various concubines, so she was seated with the wives of the other princes. Royal Princess Duanjia was at the table next to hers, where all the princesses were seated. Imperial Princess Leia was placed diagonally across from Royal Princess Duanjia. Chu Lien was sitting beside Matriarch He, with other noble madams of the same rank. There was one more seat reserved for House Ying's matriarch here, but House Ying's matriarch hadn't come, seemingly due to health issues. Other than their matriarch, none of the madams of House Ying were qualified to enter the banquet. Thus, Chu Lian didn't see anyone from housing here in Ningyi Palace. When Chu Lian turned to look at Empress Xin, who was giving a speech, she felt a burning gaze like coals on her. She followed the sensation, only to meet with Imperial Princess Liao's eyes. Princess Liao was so angry that her little hands were curled into fists. She had never suffered a setback like that before. With her high and mighty status, if she wanted to teach anyone a lesson, she would be able to do so without any restraint. Even if they died in the process, no one would be able to touch her. Now, all she had been trying to do was to make trouble for Brother He's annoying wife. However, she kept failing to do so. She could still accept it when she had failed at the Dingyuan estate. It wasn't her territory after all. However, now that Chu Lian was in the palace, her schemes were still failing spectacularly. How could she not be angry? If she could, Imperial Princess Liao would kill Chu Lian on the spot to relieve this hatred within her. Chu Lian's gaze swept over Imperial Princess Liao once before she shifted her eyes elsewhere, as if she hadn't seen that burning hatred in the princess's eyes. Chu Lian performed perfectly at the banquet, doing everything as customary. She didn't attract anyone's attention nor did she flout any rules of etiquette. She was just waiting for the banquet to end so she could go home to Songtao Court, have a nice hot bath and then fall in bed for a good night's sleep. In the later half of the banquet, it was time for the round cakes to be judged. The offered round cakes from each estate were placed in similar silver trays. The top 10 ranked noble madams and imperial family members would then taste each one before choosing a winner. From her conversation with Royal Princess Duanjia earlier, Chu Lian knew that this competition wasn't as fair as most people would think. The round cakes that she had submitted were also a little different from most, so she wasn't too worried about being chosen as the winner. She just sat calmly and ate while watching the show. Although the food for this imperial banquet wasn't too tasty, the fruits offered after the main meal were delicious. They were serving dragon fruits and mangosteens that were part of the tributes from the western regions. They never had a chance to taste these in the Jingyan estate. It was unexpected that the Empress Dowager would bring these rare fruits out for her guests at this banquet. The round cake competition was at its peak when the eunuch guarding the entrance at Ningyi Palace suddenly announced, "The Emperor has arrived." Normally, the Emperor wouldn't come to Ningyi Palace. In previous years, it had always been either the Empress Dowager or the Empress hosting banquets like this. Their guests would also be the ladies of the noble houses. In the past 2 years, the Qingping Emperor had never come to grace the mid-autumn banquet. However, since he was here now, the crowd was naturally happy to see him. They didn't have much chance to peek at the face of the almighty Emperor on normal days. The Qingping Emperor had purely come over for a change of pace after facing boredom in his imperial study. He hadn't arranged this visit in advance. He happened to chance upon the judging of the round cakes, so he joined the judges since he was in a good mood. The banquet became even more lively after the arrival of the Emperor. In a short moment, the judging was over. The scroll with the result was passed to one of the court ladies who served in the Empress Dowager's palace. The Qingping Emperor was seated next to the Empress Dowager as he chatted warmly with her, all the while listening to the court lady announce the winner of this year's round cake competition. The announcer's voice was bright and clear, covering the entire hall in an instant. The madams seated at the same table as Lady Pan were already smiling and congratulating her in low voices, without waiting for the announcer to finish speaking. Lady Pan was also full of pleasant smiles upon receiving their congratulations. A nice warmth settled in her heart. The announcer's voice rang out in the hall. After the judge's appraisal, the winner of this year's competition is House Jingyan. Chapter 205, Not Accepting the Loss. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian had been in the middle of leisurely drinking some 9-flower honey water that a palace servant had poured out for her. The moment she heard that announcement, she almost choked on the water and ended up coughing intensely. What? How could the winner of the competition be House Jing'an? Fortunately, they were seated far away from the main center of attention, so her moment of inelegance hadn't been noticed by many. Shi Yan quickly passed a handkerchief over to Chu Lian, worriedly whispering a question into her ear. "Third young madam, are you all right?" Chu Lian waved her hand, indicating that she was fine. By this time, most of the noble madams had turned to look in the direction of House Jing'an's ladies. After a moment's pause, some noble madams started giving their congratulations to Matriarchy. Matriarchy had been stunned for a few seconds. However, she reacted just in time to lead her two granddaughters-in-law in graciously accepting the congratulations headed their way. Lady Pan was seated at a table right in front of them. Sharing her table was the wife of one of her husband's colleagues in court, Lady Yang. Lady Pan's table was currently frozen in the midst of an awkward atmosphere. Just now, before the court lady had started announcing the winner, the madams at this table had already started congratulating Lady Pan. However, now that the winner wasn't the Pan estate, their words had turned into slaps on Lady Pan's face. Each of the madams who had spoken up too early all had their heads lowered and their mouths tightly shut. They were trying their best to disappear into the ground. Only Lady Yang remained calm with a smile on her face. Lady Pan's warm and ever-friendly face had lost its modest and amiable air, and was currently as black as the bottom of a pot. She looked up at the main seats in the hall in disbelief. Everything had been arranged beforehand. How had everything changed just like that? How could it be House Jing'an that had won? Unable to hold back her rage, she stood up and took in a few deep breaths before she could manage to bring out a smile. She turned to the table that Matriarchy was seated at and said, "Matriarchy, that's quite the talent you've hidden away. I wonder if I might have the luck to taste the round cakes you've offered up today." Chu Lian's brows furrowed together. However, Matriarchy was the most senior member of the family present right now, so it wasn't her place to speak as a granddaughter-in-law. Lady Yang also stood up. However, she didn't say a word and simply continued looking in the direction of House Jing'an with a smile in her eyes. When she looked at Chu Lian, her expression turned especially warm and kind. Lady Pan refused to believe that House Jing'an's round cakes had managed to win the competition. The others might still be in the dark, but she knew for a fact that House Jing'an's round cakes had been stolen away by someone when they had entered Ningyi Palace. If some random replacement cakes from who knows where could win the competition, it would be a slap in the face to all the noble participants here. She was going to expose House Jing'an's tricks today, right in front of the Emperor. Let's see how they'll be able to hold their head up high in the capital from now on. Imperial Concubine Wei was seated diagonally across from the tables where all the noble titled ladies were. She happened to glance over curiously at the area where House Jing'an's table was situated. When she saw that some noble madams had stood up and seemed to be fighting, the corners of her eyes tilted upwards in a subtle display of her inner joy. If they didn't start fighting by now, that would have been a waste of this whole play she had arranged. When the Qingping Emperor cast his gaze sideways, he noticed that Imperial Concubine Wei's expression was all smiles. He took up his wine cup for a sip, using that movement to follow where her gaze was directed at. He suddenly spoke up, "Concubine, it seems like you're rather happy today." Imperial Concubine Wei froze for a moment before quickly discarding the out-of-place expression on her face. She replied in a coquettish manner, "Your Majesty, this lovely mid-autumn festival only comes around once a year. How could your humble concubine not be joyous?" The Qingping Emperor turned his gaze onto her and set down his wine cup, uttering an ambiguous, "Is it so?" in reply. "Of course, how could your humble concubine dare to deceive your Majesty?" Royal Princess Duanjia had also noticed the commotion. When she saw that Chu Lian seemed to be in trouble, she quickly stood up, wanting to go over to help. However, she was held back by Princess Wei. Mother! Don't stop me, I want to go over to take a look. That idiot Chu Lu is getting bullied again. Princess Wei glared at her. You're forbidden from going there. If you go there now, you'll just be adding to the trouble. Jeannie isn't as stupid as you might think. If she really didn't have a way to deal with them, she would naturally have sent someone to us for help. But, no buts. Stay here and watch. Who knows if the bully will end up getting their way. After Princess Wei had given her orders, Royal Princess Duanjia could only sit down and watch the situation over there with a face full of anxiety. Matriarchy had been socializing for years with these noble madams since she was a young lady herself. So of course she wasn't someone to be bullied so easily. Lady Pan's forceful request to take a look at House Jingyan's round cakes had clearly come out of her disbelief that they could win the competition, and she was clearly looking to make some trouble for them. When Matriarchy noticed the confidence in Lady Pan's expression, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. That mysterious attacker who had stolen away their estate's round cakes definitely had something to do with this Lady Pan. Although Matriarchy was already getting on in age and her hair was completely white, her eyes were still sharp and she still had her wits about her. Matriarchy didn't back down one bit. Instead, it was Madame Zhou who shrunk back upon facing the eyes of all the other noble madams around them. She shuffled behind the matriarch in an attempt to hide herself. She had completely forgotten her jealousy of Chu Lian taking her place to offer up the round cakes, and was simply relieved that this had nothing to do with her. Chu Lian was standing by Matriarchy's side and holding on to her arm. When she saw that Matriarchy hadn't backed down, had even straightened up, Chu Lian felt like she had grown a few inches taller. Lady Pan, are you purposely trying to trouble this old woman? The round cakes have already been offered up to the Empress Dowager. If Lady Pan would like to taste them, then I'm afraid you'll have to ask for that favor from the Empress Dowager herself. Chapter 206, Not Accepting the Loss. 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Lady Pan was so enraged that her hands had started trembling, hidden under the broad sleeves of her court dress. She tossed her sleeves and left the banquet area. When she reached the platform where the esteemed personages were seated, she bowed towards the Empress Dowager. The Empress Dowager was already old, so she couldn't see clearly the person who had just walked up to the bottom of the platform and greeted her. It was a court lady at the side who quickly informed her of the person's identity. Lady Pan. What business do you have? Although Empress Shen didn't know what had happened behind the scenes at the banquet today, she was happy to watch the drama unfold. She continued looking upon the scene before her with her eyebrows raised. When Lady Pan heard the Empress Dowager personally replying her excitement sparked. She replied respectfully, replying to Your Grace, for the sake of the Mid-Autumn Banquet's round cake competition, your humble servant started researching on new recipes for round cakes half a year ago. Thus, it's quite hard for your humble servant to accept today's loss. Might Your Grace be inclined to favor your humble servant with some of the winning round cakes of this year's competition? Your humble servant will be able to rest easy upon tasting them. Lady Pan had a distinguished and powerful background, so she was able to speak so freely to the Empress Dowager. If it had been any other courtier's wife who had dared to cast even the slightest bit of doubt on the Empress Dowager's decision, they would have been accused of the crime of lèse-majesté. However, even if it was Lady Pan who had brought forth such a request, her actions were still slightly inappropriate. When the Empress Dowager heard the reason for this request, her expression turned stormy. Actually, the Empress Dowager couldn't care less for the judging of the round cakes. In her old age, she had simply wanted to enjoy some lively festivities at the Mid-Autumn Banquet. However, this doubting of her judgment had caused her mood to turn sour. Although the Empress Dowager didn't take Lady Pan to blame for her request, her voice had lost all traces of kindness when she replied. Since that is so, I'll let you satisfy your uneasiness. Go, bring over House Jingant's round cakes and let all the noble madams try some. The court lady-in-waiting serving the Empress Dowager bobbed in acknowledgement before quickly leading away 2 handmaids to the area where the round cakes were on display. The Qingping Emperor sat at the highest seat, casting his gaze on the proceedings below him without any change in expression, as if he hadn't been the one to pick the winner of the round cake competition. When Lady Pan heard that the Empress Dowager had actually acquiesced to her request, she immediately relaxed. She turned to look in the direction of House Jingant's ladies with a disdainful glare, as if she had already seen their terrible end. The court lady serving the Empress Dowager was conscientious in her work. She split House Jingant's round cakes into many portions and had them placed in pure white porcelain dishes. She then instructed a few handmaids to serve them up to Lady Pan, as well as the Emperor, his wives, and the extended imperial family. A handmaid brought the porcelain dish up to Lady Pan's side. She knelt down and said, "Noble madam, this is today's winning round cakes. Please have a taste." When the handmaid finished speaking, the noble madams around her had already focused their gazes on the dish in her hands. When they looked at the confection offered up on that porcelain dish, they drew in their breaths in surprise. It was a round confection with a flowery pattern on top. The edges were repeating waves that formed a flower, while an exquisite, fortunate word was carved into the pastry skin that had been baked into a beautiful golden brown. Each piece was only about the size of half an egg and there were 5 in the dish. Impossible! How could there be such a complicated pattern on such a small piece of confection? The amount of detail on it was comparable to a piece of embroidery. Even before the noble madams had taken a single bite, their attention had already been stolen away by the exquisiteness of the pastries. Madame So stared at that small dish of confections in disbelief. Where had these beautiful confections come from? Why hadn't she seen or known of these before? When her mind led her to this thought, she abruptly turned to Chu Lien, who was standing next to Matriarchy. It was her. It was her younger sister-in-law again. Actually, Matriarchy hadn't seen Chu Lien's replacements for the round cakes either, so her heart had been beating like a drum in her chest. Upon seeing the confections for herself, half of the anxiety in her heart eased away. She turned to Chu Lien with a warm gaze, and Chu Lien returned it with a faint smile. However, Lady Pan's expression had turned for the worse. She picked up one of the offered pastries with a trembling hand. When she bit through the pastry skin, there was some soft stuffing inside that looked translucent. She couldn't tell what it was made of, but it was similar to the stuffing in round cakes. There was even a thin layer of sweetened bean paste in the center. The pastry was very small, so you wouldn't feel very full after eating one. The soft skin broke easily while the stuffing within was slightly sweet and sticky with a hint of the fragrance of red beans. After finishing off one piece, even Lady Pan felt like taking up one more piece from the dish. It was only when she had reached her hand out that she remembered what she had set out to do. She gulped the saliva that had pooled in her mouth from eating House Jingant's round cake. Although she wasn't willing to admit it, the truth was staring her in the face. Furthermore, everyone was about to get a chance to taste House Jingant's round cakes, and the voices of the people would decide this match. She couldn't refute the judgment any further. After Lady Pan had taken a mooncake, Lady Yang had immediately taken one for herself as well. After eating it up, she shot a satisfied look over at Chu Lien. The remaining mooncakes were split between the other noble madams, who all voiced their praise for the confections. Princess Wei's table had also been given some mooncakes. When Royal Princess Duanjia looked at the confection placed before her mother, she commented on what she found strange about it. This pastry. Isn't this the same one I took from Chu Lu in the Imperial Gardens? Chu Lu told me these were called mooncakes or something. How did they turn into round cakes? Oh. Mooncakes. Chu Lu said so. But whatever they're called, they're really delicious. Mother, try it now. The one I ate had some salty egg yolk inside. Princess Wei smiled and bit into that exquisite little mooncake. This one was actually salty. There was ham in the stuffing. Wonderful. It suited her tastes exactly. In the grand hall of Ningyi Palace, everyone who had eaten House Jing'an's round cake stared at Lady Pan with strange looks. Lady Pan had been completely disgraced today. She took the initiative to step up to the Empress Dowager and admit her wrong. As the banquet continued, she didn't say a single word. When the banquet ended, she led her servants away with her and quickly left the palace. It seemed like she wouldn't be bothering to make some small talk after the banquet today. Chapter 207, A Request from Old Duchess Xing. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. Since House Jing'an's round cakes had won the competition, Matriarchy was surrounded by all the noble ladies who wanted to congratulate her on the win. The Empress Dowager even specially awarded her with a sapphire headdress, adding on to House Jing'an's glory at the event. Even after so many years, Matriarchy had never enjoyed such attention in the palace before. Of course, she was in an extremely good mood now. Chu Lian kept by her grandmother's side, so there were many questions directed towards her by the noble ladies around them. Since Matriarchy had the intention of introducing her to the others, Chu Lian took the chance to get acquainted with a number of noble madams in the capital. When it was time to leave the palace, Princess Wei specially sent one of her court ladies over to invite her over to Prince Wei's estate to play in a few days, thus drawing another wave of envy from the ladies gathered. When they finally reached House Jing'an's carriage, Chu Lian was about to help Matriarchy up the carriage when they were hailed by an elderly madam who had come rushing over from behind. This elderly madam was no stranger, it was old Duchess Xing. There was a middle-aged lady following next to the old Duchess, who was slightly chubby. When she smiled, her eyes morphed into upturned crescents, giving her a friendly appearance. "Old sister, please hold on." Matriarchy turned around only to see her old friend. She smiled in welcome. "We're sisters, the two of us. Why the rush? Walk a little slower, and be careful not to strain your waist." Old Duchess Xing came over with a wide smile. When she reached Matriarchy's side, she first smiled at Chu Lian before talking to the matriarch. "I have come looking for old sister for a certain matter. There's no need to be so courteous between us. Just say it straight." Matriarchy answered generously. Old Duchess Xing was about to speak of her matter when Chu Lian caught sight of some people who had just exited the palace behind them. That person with a round face and slender brows, wasn't that Lady Pan? Hadn't she left the banquet early on? Why was she only exiting the palace at this hour? Chu Lian's brows drew together in a slight frown. They had offended Lady Pan today, so she was afraid that they would get into a quarrel if they bumped into each other now. She spoke up with a suggestion. "Grandmother, there are many people coming and going from the palace entrance here. How about chatting inside the carriage instead? It might be more comfortable for grandmother and old Duchess Xing." Matriarchy had clearly spotted Lady Pan on the way out of the palace with her group of servants in tow. Thus, she invited old Duchess Xing onto House Jing'an's wide carriage and they boarded together. Although the carriage was quite spacious, it wasn't meant to be a room after all. When all four of them entered, it became a little cramped. Madame Zhou had just lifted the curtain and was about to enter, when Matriarchy spoke to her. "Dalong's wife, the carriage is a little cramped. Go to the other carriage at the back instead." The hand that Madame Zhou was using to hold up the carriage curtain clenched. She looked up at the four people seated in the carriage before bowing slightly to Matriarchy and leaving for the other carriage. Chu Lian glanced at Madame Zhou's departing figure and sighed inwardly. The distance between them had still increased in the end. Her eldest sister-in-law was already looking at her through tinted glasses. From now on, no matter what she did, Madame Zhou would probably look badly on her. Chu Lian wasn't one to go seeking trouble if no one tried to attack her. Although she didn't like squabbling over petty matters, she wasn't one to sit back and let others take her to task either. In the future, she and Madame Zhou would be like a well and a river, their waters were not to seep and mix into each other. Duke Zheng's estate wasn't far from Count Jing'an's estate. They would be taking the same route along Zhuke Avenue for some time anyway, so this was a convenient time for them to talk. With House Zheng's carriage following behind, the two old sisters chatted in House Jing'an's carriage with a lively air. Old Duchess Zheng had also seen something fishy in the events at the banquet. She held on to Matriarchy's hand and reassured her, it's not uncommon for things like that to happen when it comes to such a big occasion. It's fine as long as you've made it out safely. Matriarchy nodded and smiled at old Duchess Zheng. Oh you. Stop thinking about that. Hasn't our house benefited from that unfortunate turn of events? Old Duchess Zheng smiled and looked at Chu Lian. After tasting those round cakes, I just knew it was your young lady's idea. Since San Lang isn't at home, you probably don't have much to do in your estate. Come to the Zheng estate with your grandmother some other time. Chu Lian was slightly surprised. She hadn't thought that old Duchess Zheng would take the initiative to give her an invite to her estate. In the original story, this old madam was like a hermit. She would only socialize with the few madams she had befriended in her younger days. Chu Lian turned to Matriarchy. For a matter like this, it was better for Matriarchy to make decision for her as the senior member of her family. Matriarchy was very satisfied with Chu Lian's action. She playfully rebuked her old friend, I think you just want to taste my granddaughter-in-law's culinary skills for yourself. Inviting her to have some fun is just a pretense. Even though old Duchess Zheng and Matriarchy had already been close friends for a few decades, when she heard Matriarchy exposing her ploy, she still blushed a little. She sighed lightly, I'm not going to hide things from you. I've brought my daughter-in-law along with a request. Chu Lian found it strange. Duke Zheng had a very successful career and their only heir was in the Imperial College. In the coming autumn examinations, he would definitely be able to score in the higher ranks. It could be said that all things were going smoothly for House Zheng. Why then, did old Duchess Zheng need to request help from Matriarchy? Even if she were to request for help, something that troubled House Zheng was likely something that Matriarchy wouldn't be able to help with. Although Matriarchy was highly regarded in their social circles and was even close friends with the Empress Dowager, she didn't have the power to interfere with the court. Suddenly, a thought flashed through Chu Lian's mind, which rendered her speechless. Do speak directly. As long as it's something within my means, I'll do my best to help. Old Duchess Zheng shot a sideways look at Matriarchy and seemed a little tongue-tied. When the younger Duchess Zheng saw that her mother-in-law was too embarrassed to speak up, she helped her out by saying, Matriarchy, the matter is like this. Chapter 208, A Request from Duchess Zheng. 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. When Matriarchy heard her explanation, she was stunned. She couldn't have imagined that the problem laid with old Duke Zheng. Apparently, he was currently bedridden and refusing food and drink. Those close to House Zheng knew that old Duke Zheng was a glutton for food. He had visited most of the top-ranked restaurants in the capital. Ever since he had passed the Duke's seat to his heir, old Duke Zheng would travel far and wide every day to search for any and all gourmet food. He had recently returned home 2 months ago, but for some reason, he had completely lost his appetite. It was almost to the point that old Duke Zheng was refusing to eat any food at all. When the reason behind her request was revealed, the two duchesses Xing looked at Chu Lian with hope in their eyes. Chu Lian felt a little embarrassed to be the focus of their expectant stares. Matriarch, he hadn't thought that old Duchess Sheng's request would turn out to be something like this. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Her only choice was to tell the truth. Old sister, I know that you're worried for old Duke Sheng. I'll just speak honestly with you. Sanlang's wife does know how to make some interesting new dishes, but we can't promise that we'll be able to solve your problem for you. We can only say that Sanlang's wife will try her best. Of course. As long as honored Lady Jeannie is willing to help out, I'll be endlessly grateful. We have simply run out of ideas. The old man isn't willing to eat anything at all. If this continues, his body won't be able to hold on. It was clear by her tone that old Duchess Sheng was anxious. After they had finally gotten Chu Lian's agreement as well as Matriarchy's promise to help with old Duchess Sheng's request, they set the date to come visit the Jing estate for 3 days later. Chu Lian wanted to hide her face in her hands, but she honestly didn't know whether it was to start sobbing or laughing her heart out. In the original story, old Duke Xing had passed away about 2 months from now. Had the cause of his death truly been from refusing food after being unable to taste the gourmet flavors he craved for? When they reached the point where their paths home diverged, old Duchess Xing bid her farewells and led her daughter-in-law back to their own carriage. Now only Matriarch He and Chu Lian were left in the carriage. Matriarch He gently petted Chu Lian's fair, tender hand. Lianer, you've done us a great service today. Otherwise, our house would have completely lost its reputation. Chu Lian realized that the matriarch liked to call her Lianer when they were talking in private. She smiled and said, "Grandmother, don't say that. I'm also a part of House Jing'an. I was just doing my part for our house." When she heard Chu Lian's answer, Matriarch He was even more gratified. "You silly child. It's been hard for you. It's not all your eldest sister-in-law's fault today, so don't hold a grudge against her. Grandmother knows that it's not easy for her either." Chu Lian felt a slight pang of shock. She hadn't expected the matriarch to think that she might hold a grudge. We're all one big family. What is there to hold a grudge over? Eldest sister-in-law couldn't have known that she would lose the round cakes like that. We still need eldest sister-in-law to manage our household in the future. Grandmother knows. Your eldest sister-in-law has been treating you too harshly recently. Don't worry, grandmother will remind her of her duties. Chu Lian tried her best to suppress the fright in her heart. She didn't realize that Matriarch He had those sorts of thoughts in her mind. Did she think that Chu Lian had come out to save the day and bring glory to the family just to slap Madame Zhou in the face for mistreating her? Chu Lian inwardly sighed. The fatigue of the day was starting to catch up with her. No wonder the older generations liked to say that communication was key. Chu Lian felt that clearing the misunderstanding with Matriarch He right now would be better than letting it persist and affect her later on. Chu Lian looked up at the matriarch. Her almond-shaped eyes shone with intelligence under the dim lighting of the lanterns within the carriage. Grandmother, there's an order of seniority in the family. It was granddaughter-in-law's fortune to be able to marry into the He family. Granddaughter-in-law doesn't have much ambition or talent, and would just like to live out peaceful days full of making delicious food. If it earns some income, then that's even better. Granddaughter-in-law is very lazy. After doing all these things, granddaughter-in-law would rather take a nap in the courtyard or give grandmother some company. Although Sanlang is from the main line of inheritance, he's the third son after all. There are 2 older brothers above him, and granddaughter-in-law naturally ranks the lowest in this family. Eventually, we might even have a second sister-in-law joining the family. What Chu Lian wanted to say was that she really didn't want to be in control of the household, and she didn't have any intention at all to oust eldest brother-in-law or eldest sister-in-law from their places in the family. As she watched the young girl before her making such a clear case for herself, Matriarchy's sharp eyes grew ever brighter. In the end, she sighed and patted Chu Lian's hand. Grandmother has blamed you unjustly. Chu Lian was finally able to relax. Everything that she had just said were her true thoughts. It was better to be a layabout. Who would want to crack their brains thinking about how to support a noble house all day? As well as trying to figure out how to best socialize with the various other noble houses in the capital? Chu Lian smiled and shook her head. I don't blame grandmother. Our hearts are all hidden in our chests. Even the wisest man wouldn't be able to see into human hearts. Granddaughter-in-law just hopes that grandmother can voice out any problems first, rather than keeping it inside. Granddaughter-in-law will definitely change for the better. Being frank and sincere, as well as opening your heart, was the best way to communicate. Chu Lian had no desire to play twisted mind games with others. Matriarchy found that she was starting to like this granddaughter-in-law of hers even more, after this honest talk with her in the carriage. She reached out to poke Chu Lian in the forehead. You silly girl. Don't think that grandmother can't see through your thoughts. You just want to laze at home all day. Although your eldest sister-in-law is around to take care of the family, you can't be too lazy either, since you're the lady in charge for your branch of the family. In the future, when all of us seniors aren't around anymore, you and Sanlang will have to separate your branch of the family and live on your own. If you don't know how to do anything at all, how are you going to manage your own house in the future? After Chu Lian had cleared away the doubts in Matriarchy's heart, she started to act cutely like a child towards the matriarch. Matriarchy was the first senior who had treated her well since she had come to the Great Wu dynasty, so she had already taken this affable old woman to be her real grandmother in her heart. She leaned against Matriarchy's side and playfully replied, but grandmother will still be around to help granddaughter-in-law out. When Sanlang and I leave the estate to create our own household, grandmother has to come along, too. Otherwise, granddaughter-in-law won't be able to manage a household on her own. The servants will make fun of me then. You little imp. Since you already know that, why are you still trying to think of ways to skive off all day? Chapter 209, An Old Matriarch's Worries. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Even though Matriarchy said that, she knew that Sanlang's wife wasn't stupid. She had been watching Sanlang's wife this whole time. Perhaps she really was a lazy bones and didn't like to manage others. However, her little courtyard was managed very well. It was clear that Chu Lian just didn't like to work. Why had she been so wary of this lazy little imp trying to steal the main branch's authority? She was really getting on in her years if she hadn't even been able to recognize Chu Lian's true nature. Alright. All you know how to do is act like a spoiled child. Wait until Sanlang comes back, then you can use that act on him instead. Grandmother's heart can't take your silliness anymore. Oh yes, what about that restaurant grandmother gave to you? How is it doing now? Chu Lian chuckled and sat up straight again before she replied, Don't worry, grandmother. Granddaughter-in-law has already made some arrangements. We'll be able to reopen in a few more days. By then, grandmother has to help granddaughter-in-law out and grace the restaurant with your illustrious presence. When her thoughts led to the restaurant, something else had the matriarch worrying all over again. The title of Count Jing'an was surely going to be passed down to Daolong. Sanlang had left so hurriedly for the northern border. Who knew if he would be able to make a name for himself out there? Although Sanlang's wife was a good child, with housing as her background, she surely didn't have much money at hand now. How was she supposed to maintain her own household in the future? She only hoped that this young girl could really make something out of Gillen Restaurant again. She didn't hope for Chu Lian to earn tons of gold. It would be good enough if she could have at least a meager source of income for her household. That way, when Sam Lang returned in a few more years, the couple would have a nice nest egg. As long as matriarchy helped out by adding some gold here and there, their lives wouldn't be too poor. Now there was only that disappointing brat, Erlang, who still refused to marry. Matriarchy had to keep some money in reserve for him as well. With so many areas to fund, as full as her purse might be now, it was slowly being slimmed further and further. Her daughter-in-law's medicine fees would still have to be drawn from the shared household funds, too. That would be a humongous expense. When she thought of this, matriarchy started feeling overwhelmed by all her worries. To most people, it might look like a bed of roses to be a member of a noble house. However, if the noble house didn't have someone who knew how to earn money, then searching for sources of income was a massive headache on its own. When matriarchy was younger and in charge of the He household, she had managed to save up a good amount of money for her personal funds. She could be considered a rather wise matriarch from this action alone. However, she still wasn't all that good at business, and she had only managed to keep the properties in her hands running as per usual, rather than improving them somehow. Later on, when she passed on the household management to her daughter-in-law, Countess Jing'an hadn't been in charge for long. She had given birth to her 3 sons during those years and hurt her body. The household management rights had been passed back to matriarchy. It wasn't until Madame Zhou had married into the family that the rights had passed into her hands. However, Madame Zhou was even worse at making money than matriarchy, so it was good enough that their stores had even been able to continue operating as usual. If not for the fact that matriarchy had trained up some loyal managers in her younger days and kept them in charge of the family properties, most of their businesses would probably be in the same state as Gillen Restaurant. House Jing'an didn't have much spare income, and it was impossible for Madame Zhou to expect any extra money from her mother-in-law, Madame Lu. Her dowry had all been used for her own medicine. Although matriarchy did contribute some funds to the household from time to time, she had to keep enough for her grandsons as well, so she didn't give much. Madame Zhou hadn't been able to give Daolong any heirs for so many years, so she put all her heart into managing the household to assuage her inner guilt. Sometimes, when the household expenses exceeded the monthly budget, she would use her own personal funds to cover the difference. However, this wasn't a long-term solution. Madame Zhou's personal funds weren't unlimited. Erlang was serving in the Dragon Guards and didn't come home much. He practically wasn't involved with managing the household at all. Daolong had gotten a slack position. Although he tried his best to support the Jing'an estate, he was still a military man to his core, just like his father, Count Jing'an. He looked down upon merchants and their sneaky ways, so he rarely bothered with helping to increase the estate's income. The men of the He family were all hotheads. Although they didn't spend much, they didn't think to make more money for the family either. This had the ladies of the Jing'an estate racking their brains for ways to keep their household afloat. If they had more clan members like the other noble families did, they would still be all right. If the main branch wasn't good at business, then they still had the other branches to support the family. However, Count Jing'an was the only son, and their ancestors had mostly been single sons as well. Old Count Jing'an had a brother, but he had died on the battlefield, leaving behind a single daughter. That daughter had gotten married, but she died in the 2nd year of marriage due to a difficult birth, and they hadn't managed to save her child either. It was only when they reached He Changdi's generation that they had miraculously gotten 3 sons in the same generation. This was also why matriarchy still favored and respected Madame Lu, even though she had gotten injured while giving birth to He Changdi and was now mostly bedridden. Madame Lu had helped the He family spread their family tree. However, who could have expected that their youngest generation would cause them so much worry? The eldest son's wife hadn't been able to give birth to a male heir despite close to 10 years of marriage. The second son refused to marry. Worried for Sanlang's future, matriarchy had been forced to plead the Empress Dowager to bestow an engagement to a lady of Housing for He Changdi. Now that she thought about it, after so many years, that decision was the best one she had ever made. Chapter 210, An Old Matriarch's Worries. 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Although the matriarch was deep in thought, in reality, not too much time had passed. Chu Lian noticed how occupied matriarch he was and didn't disturb her. Suddenly, matriarchy's eyes caught sight of a brocade box placed to the side. This was the sapphire headdress that the Empress Dowager had awarded them for winning the round cake competition. Her expression changed slightly and she turned to look at Chu Lian. Her young granddaughter-in-law's eyes were fluttering as she fought the urge to sleep. Her head was shaking as she was close to nodding off. The worry in matriarchy's heart eased away for a moment. This child was just a carefree one, never taking anything to heart. Something that would draw the average person's attention was no more than background decoration to her. She really wondered how Housing had managed to bring up a lady with this kind of personality. Sanlang's wife. Wake up. After calling once without receiving a reply, in fact, Chu Lian's head was about to hit the wall of the carriage, matriarch found the situation was actually rather funny. She reached out and lightly poked her sleepy granddaughter-in-law. Chu Lian jolted awake. It had been a tiring day for her, after all. Her nerves had been tightly wound all day, and it was only now that she finally got the chance to relax. Her eyelids were struggling to stay open. "Ah. Grandmother, what's wrong? Are we home yet?" Matriarchy purposely put on a strict expression as she said, "What do you mean, are we home yet? There's still a long way to go." Chu Lian's shoulders drooped. "It's too tiring to enter the palace. Grandmother, please don't bring granddaughter-in-law here next time. Granddaughter-in-law prefers to sleep at home and cook." Matriarchy patted Chu Lian's slender shoulders a little helplessly. "You're really a lazy little imp. Alright, drink some tea to help your mind stay awake. We don't even have a blanket in this carriage, so you can't sleep. It won't be good if you catch a cold. We're almost home, so hang in there for a while longer." Chu Lian slapped her own cheeks and managed to chase away some of her sleepiness. When she turned and saw that matriarchy was still watching her with no small degree of amusement, she tilted her head to the side and asked, "Does grandmother have something else to say?" When matriarchy's eyes met with the bright, clear eyes of Sanlang's wife, she felt a mysterious comfort soothe her heart. She nodded and pointed at the brocade box in the corner. "Lianer, who do you think this headdress should belong to?" Chu Lian cast a sideways glance at the brocade box before remembering that this was the sapphire headdress that the Empress Dowager had awarded to them. She wasn't all that interested in accessories. She would simply wear some normal ones usually, and she wasn't very picky with them. Furthermore, she had managed to peek at the headdress when the Empress Dowager had awarded it to them. It was indeed an exquisite, expensive-looking ornament. However, perhaps due to the passing of time, the style it was made in was a little old, and it didn't suit a young girl like her. Matriarchy was watching Chu Lian. When her eyes drifted to the brocade box, her expression had remained unchanged as if the contents didn't attract her one bit. The matriarch was satisfied with this reaction. Granddaughter-in-law feels that this headdress should be given to eldest sister-in-law. Eldest sister-in-law has also suffered no small amount of fright today. Chu Lian said with a smile. As much as she had already lost all interest in making friends with Madame Zhou, since matriarchy was clearly expecting her to say something along those lines, then she would go along with her wishes. Anyway, matriarchy was still going to be the one in charge of determining the recipient of the headdress. She knew that matriarchy would still give it to Madame Zhou in the end, no matter what she said. Since the stage was already set like this, why go against the flow? Actually, Chu Lian didn't really care. Anyway, it wouldn't end up in her hands anyway, so it didn't matter who got it. And since it was a gift from the Empress Dowager, they couldn't even sell it for money, anyway. Getting it was the same as getting a pretty decoration to occasionally admire. As expected, Matriarchy's smile turned softer. Good child, you're starting to think along the same lines as grandmother now. Chu Lian was as thick-skinned as they came. After receiving Matriarchy's praise, she didn't blush at all. She even smiled from ear to ear, showing off her pearly white teeth. When they returned to the Jingyan estate, Matriarchy instructed her to return to her courtyard to rest. She was still in the middle of growing, after all. Chu Lian didn't stand on courtesy. Rather than refusing the offer, she declined to send Matriarchy back to her own courtyard, and let Shiyan help her back to Songtao Court. She had gone out in the morning and only arrived back when it was dark. Chu Lian had zero energy left after this exhausting day. Wenqing even had to be on standby to help her while she bathed. Chu Lian climbed onto the bed and burrowed under her blankets. It wasn't long before she fell asleep. Senior servant Gui was both gratified and sympathetic to her plight. She pulled the covers over Chu Lian before ordering Jingyan to keep watch over her. It was only then that she returned to her own room to rest. Chapter 211, Food Delivery, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. A day after the Mid-Autumn Festival, Jingyan, He Changqi, invited his friends to a small gathering at their estate. Keeping to the promise she had made earlier with Matriarchy and eldest brother-in-law, when it was close to noon, Chu Lian guided her maidservants as they worked together to prepare a few special dishes to be sent to the outer court later. However, Chu Lian was He Changdi's wife after all. It wouldn't be very appropriate if she and her maidservants brought the dishes to the outer court just like that. She thought for a moment and decided that it would be better to go over to Qingxi Hall first and let Matriarchy's servants send the dishes instead. When they arrived at the entrance of Qingxi Hall, they could hear the sounds of conversation from inside. Matriarchy's handmaid, Mu Xiang, happened to be on her way out at this time, and spotted Chu Lian at the entrance. She smiled and greeted her, "Third young madam, you've come over. Please come in. Eldest young madam and the two young ladies are already inside." After she said so, she lifted the bamboo blinds covering the entrance for Chu Lian and took over the big box of food from Mingyan's hands. Next, she followed behind Chu Lian as she walked into the parlor of Qingxi Hall. Matriarchy was seated in the highest-ranked seat. She didn't know what Matriarchy and Madame Zhou were talking about, but they were laughing together and obviously in a very good mood. Chu Lian's gaze shot over to Madame Zhou. She noticed that Madame Zhou was wearing a navy blue dress made in the latest style, with a sheer smoky blue outer garment. The ornament on her head was the sapphire headdress bestowed by the Empress Dowager at the Mid-Autumn Banquet. Although she was dressed elegantly, it was a pity that this headdress looked very old-fashioned and added several years to her age. Madame Zhou was only in her mid-20s, but looked to be in her mid-30s instead with this headdress. Madame Zhou was all smiles. Whatever she had said before seemed to have amused Matriarchy. Greetings to grandmother and eldest sister-in-law. Chu Lian bobbed towards the both of them. Sanlang's wife, you've arrived. Come and sit down. Your eldest brother-in-law just sent someone over from the outer court to inquire about the food. Madame Zhou cast a glance over and found that Chu Lian was still dressed in plain home clothes. Her black hair was fixed into a bun with just a single green jade hairpin and she wasn't wearing any other jewelry on her body. Only then did Madame Zhou heave a sigh of relief in her heart. It seemed that Chu Lian wasn't intending to go to the outer court, dressed like this. Chu Lian gave a slight smile. One of the dishes had to be stewed for a longer period of time, so granddaughter-in-law was delayed for a bit. Grandmother, eldest sister-in-law, please forgive granddaughter-in-law for being late. Matriarchy pulled Chu Lian to her side. If she didn't have to worry about Dalong's wife being there, matriarchy would definitely have pinched Chu Lian's tiny nose. Silly child, how could grandmother blame you? Senior servant Lu, take these food boxes to the outer court. Right after matriarchy finished speaking, Madame Zhou quickly spoke up, grandmother, since they're Dalong's close friends, there's no need to trouble senior servant Lu. It would be better for granddaughter-in-law to send it over personally. Matriarchy casually glanced at Madame Zhou's dressed-up appearance. She paused for a moment before nodding. Why don't you lead the servants and send it over then? Just be careful on the way there. Don't let Dalong lose face in front of his friends. Seeing that matriarchy had agreed, Madame Zhou heaved a sigh of relief and quickly assured her, please don't worry, grandmother. Granddaughter-in-law knows how to behave appropriately. Madame Zhou then bowed respectfully towards matriarchy before she led her servants away with the food boxes and hurried to the outer court. It wasn't until Madame Zhou's figure had passed through the entrance of the parlor that Chu Lian said with a smile, grandmother, I boiled an entire pot of old duck soup just now. I made sure that the meat is soft enough to come right off the bone, it's perfect for you to eat. Today, granddaughter-in-law offers up this dish and will trade it for a free meal here with you. Does grandmother have a seat at the table for me? Pfft, matriarchy laughed. There's no need to act like that, silly child. You can just say it out directly if you want to have a meal with grandmother. Matriarchy got busy with instructing Muxiang to have the other maidservants serve up the meal. Chu Lian ate lunch together with matriarchy in Qingxi Hall. She waited upon matriarchy until the matriarch took her afternoon nap before returning to her own Songtao court. Chapter 212, Food Delivery, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The sun was shining brightly in the sky today, making it somewhat hot and stuffy. There was a small garden next to Songtao Court filled with blooming chrysanthemum flowers, and within the cluster of chrysanthemums, there was a decorative mountain with an interesting shape. A small stream flowed continuously into a lotus pond beside the decorative mountain. Unfortunately, the lotus leaves and flowers in the pond had already withered away by this time. However, you could admire the view of the autumn chrysanthemums alongside the glimmering pond from the pavilion. The chrysanthemums adjacent to the decorative mountain made for a very beautiful scene. There was a zither room located next to this pavilion. Since it was close to Songtao Court, Chu Lian went there frequently in the afternoon to enjoy the cool weather. While returning to Songtao Court, Chu Lian happened to pass by the little zither room. She glanced at it and then told Mingyan behind her, it's a little hot today, get someone to move a lounge chair over there. I'll have a nap over in that zither room. In the outer court of the Jingyan estate, a group of young men were seated at the main table in the hall. All of them were good friends of Yi Changqi who had been invited to the small gathering. Standing amongst them was the newly appointed young official of the Honglu Temple, Lord Gu. There was also Marquis Wei Yuan, who had inherited his title not long ago from his predecessor, Madame Zhou's brother, Zhou Wu, from the second branch of House Dingyuan and House Zheng's young heir, Xing Tiancheng. There was a tall young man in a green robe right next to him. It was none other than Xiao Bojian from the Imperial College. Xiao Bojian and Yi Changqi weren't actually friends or even acquaintances. He had been invited to the Jingyan estate thanks to his connection to heir Jing. Everyone present here knew that heir Jing had a best friend who was a senior brother one grade above him at the Imperial College. Xiao Bojian's looks were a perfect match to the aesthetic taste of the people of this era. Furthermore, he had a natural gentlemanly aura and carried himself with elegance. This meant that it was rare for anyone not to have a good impression of him. Thus, Xiao Bojian had always been like a fish in water when interacting in society. People made friends with him most likely due to his good appearance and temperament while ignoring his humble background. Lord Gut sipped at his cup of sinchan smiled, Brother He, surely you're not trying to play a trick on us. It's going to be noon in the blink of an eye, but you haven't ordered your servants to start serving the meal. Are you trying to let your brother starve to death? A trace of awkwardness appeared on Changqi's face after he heard those words. A few days ago, he had boasted in front of his friends that he would be treating them to delicacies that they had never seen before. He even used the longevity peach buns from House Ding Yuan's longevity feast to tempt his group of brothers, making them crave for the food they hadn't even seen yet. However, nothing had been served up till now, so even he was starving a little. Brothers, please stay calm. Since these are delicacies we're talking about, it will definitely be worth the wait for us. Xiao Bojian displayed a gentle smile, and everyone nodded in agreement. Changqi had mentioned in advance to everyone gathered today that the entire meal would be personally prepared by the third young madam of House Jingyan, the emperor's newly conferred honored Lady Jeannie. It could be considered an honor to be able to eat the food personally made by an honored lady. At last, Changqi's manservant came over in a hurry and whispered something into his ear. Changqi lit up in delight upon hearing this. Brothers, it seems like our wait has finally paid off. As expected, in a moment, the luxuriously dressed Madame Zhou entered the parlor, leading a maidservant with a huge food box and directing her to the dining table in the hall. Changqi's friends had also gotten up to give Madame Zhou a respectful bow. Apart from Madame Zhou's older brother, each of them greeted her with a call of sister-in-law. Amongst these people, Changqi was the oldest, so there was nothing wrong with how they had addressed her. Madame Zhou rarely had the opportunity to meet with Changqi's good friends. Now that her husband had finally brought his friends over for a small gathering, she had to meet them and give them a good impression of her. However, she had dressed a little excessively today. A small gathering between close friends was supposed to be relaxed and comfortable, but she had inadvertently made the atmosphere a little stiff dressed like that. When Xiao Bojian lowered his head in a slight bow, his eyes were filled with disdain. Chapter 213, Lies, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Changqi's group of friends couldn't be bothered with judging Madame Zhou once the handmaid started bringing out dish after dish from the huge container. The first dish was a whole row of sweet and sour pork ribs covered in a thick sauce served on a delicate porcelain plate. The second dish was served in a clay pot. When the lid was lifted, the fragrant aroma of the braised duck within drifted out. Next, there was a huge serving of poached fish slices that looked as soft and tender as tofu, covered in a layer of red-hot chilies. Right after that, it was a plate of sautéed shredded pork in sweet bean sauce, decorated with thinly sliced spring onion. Then a large bowl of steaming hot tofu soup. As each dish was placed on the table, the eyes of the gentlemen seated at the table widened more and more. Finally, the handmaid brought out a small pan and stove and placed it in the center of the table. When she carefully lit up the stove, the gentlemen all wore expressions of astonishment. Zhang had never seen such a method of eating before. Furthermore, he had never seen nor eaten anything like all the delicious and fragrant dishes placed on the table before. He pointed excitedly at the lit stove in the center. Sister-in-law, what's that called? I've never seen a dish like this before, even when I visited the palace. Seated at the host's place at the table, Changqi was clearly more than satisfied with the dishes that Chu Lian had cooked for them today. Other than the poached fish slices that he had eaten before, he hadn't even seen or heard of the other delicacies placed before him now. Since Madame Zhou was to present the dishes in place of Chu Lian had already told her all about the dishes and their names. By this time, all the hungry men had turned to look up at her with expectation. Having those eyes fixed upon her gave Madame Zhou the long-awaited satisfaction of having all attention drawn to her. That satisfaction also gave her courage, the courage to follow through with a thought she had been harboring for some time. She smiled elegantly, showing off the aura of a model noble lady. Thus, He Changqi's friends heard her speak in a lovely, womanly voice. Gentlemen, the one in the center is called a dry steamboat. This method of eating is very simple. You just have to prepare all the ingredients for cooking beforehand and place it in the pan. When you want to eat, all you have to do is light the fire under this pan. It's very convenient. Zhang loved novel things, so he leaned forward to take a closer look before applauding and giving praise. Wonderful, wonderful. This is just too wonderful. With this, no matter when you're hungry, you'll be able to eat some freshly cooked food. What a great idea. The other men gave their agreement. When Madame Zhou heard Zhang's praise, she was even happier. The corners of her lips lifted up as she couldn't hold back the excitement in her heart. Indeed. I just so happened to discover this method of eating one day. I didn't think that Zhang would like it this much. The joy on the men's faces faded away and they all stiffened. He Changqi was flooded with embarrassment. He wanted to tug at his wife's sleeve to stop her, but Madame Zhou was already carrying on with her explanation. These here are poached fish slices. The red pieces floating on top are a new type of vegetable that Daolong bought over from some outsiders. I thought these looked strange and new, so I tried using them in my cooking. Who could have expected that these would enhance the flavor of these poached fish slices so much? You'll have to try it for yourself later. As for that dish over there, Madame Zhou jabbered on by herself and introduced all the dishes on the table. However, she didn't realize that the expressions of the men at the table had already changed and become a little unusual. Xiao Bojian's slanted eyes were full of disdain. He looked at Madame Zhou with contempt. This woman had just tried to claim Lianer's credit for herself. Wasn't she even the slightest bit ashamed that she was speaking such blatant lies right in front of them? He Changqi's face was already flushed red from his suppressed emotions. However, he just didn't have the heart to expose his wife, upon seeing her so animated. It wasn't until Madame Zhou had finished introducing every single dish that she realized that her surroundings had fallen silent. The air around them wasn't as lively as it had been when the dishes had been brought out. She looked around, feeling a little lost, as her heart leapt into her throat. She tried asking lightly, "What's wrong? Do you not like the dishes that sister-in-law has prepared?" The young Marquis Weiyuan and Honglu Temple's Lord Gu both exchanged looks and had a tacit understanding. Marquis Weiyuan smiled and bowed towards Madame Zhou. "Sister-in-law, you're thinking too much. It's our fortune to be able to taste sister-in-law's cooking for ourselves." After hearing Marquis Weiyuan's words, Madame Zhou's heart settled down. She was about to speak further when He Changqi quickly cut in. "All right, enough. I'm going to chat with my good friends here. Why don't you return first?" Madame Zhou could only keep her silence. It was a rare occasion for her husband to bring his friends over after all. Furthermore, they were all men. It wasn't very appropriate for her to stay in this gathering as a lady of the inner court. Thus, she bid her farewells to them and left with a distinguished and elegant air, accompanied by her maidservants. TL note, here comes the feast. Sweet and sour pork ribs, old duck soup, poached fish slices with chilies, sautéed shredded pork in sweet bean sauce, tofu soup, dry steamboat. Chapter 214, Lies, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. It wasn't long after Madame Zhou's figure had disappeared from their sights that He Changqi stood up and bowed deeply to his friends with his fists cupped together. "My humble wife wasn't honest. I would like to ask for your forgiveness, and hope that you won't hold it against her for this dishonesty." Madame Zhou didn't know that He Changqi had already told his friends about Chu Lian's cooking. However, Madame Zhou had suddenly tried to steal Chu Lian's credit in front of He Changqi and his friends. Her plan had failed and she had shown that she didn't have the virtues that a good wife should have. Not only that, she had practically slapped He-Changchi in the face in front of his good friends. Lord Gu quickly helped He-Changchi back up. Brother He, please don't blame yourself. Everyone has some form of greed for fortune and fame. Sister-in-law simply wanted to impress us brothers for your sake. There's no reason for us to blame her. Marquis Weiyuan smiled and agreed with Lord Ji's sentiment. It's rare for us all to have the time to meet. There's a great feast before us, so let's not waste it. Come, let's eat and drink. After this whole turn of events, Madame Zhou's lies had already been exposed. Although He-Changchi's friends let it pass so as to help He-Changchi keep his dignity, the same couldn't be said for their private thoughts. However, there was one point of similarity. Madame Zhou's image had been utterly destroyed in front of them. Even Zheng and Marquis Weiyuan were starting to pity He-Changchi. Without speaking of how Madame Zhou hadn't given He-Changchi a male heir yet, just based on what they had seen of her personality today, it had completely changed how these few men thought of the ladies of the Dingyuan estate. He-Changchi had been expecting to impress his friends today. However, after Madame Zhou's little play, He-Changchi was so ashamed that he couldn't hold his head high amongst his friends. Luckily, the awkward atmosphere didn't last for long. When the men started tasting the food before them, they completely forgot about Madame Zhou and her lies. All that remained in their minds was the delicious food on the table. Right here and right now, they couldn't let these delicacies go to waste. There was usually a refined and lofty air at these friendly meetings between noblemen. They would brew some tea, warm up some wine and maybe grill some venison with their good friends. If the mood was right, they might even compose a few poems or couplets with brushes in hand and wine cups in the other. Basically, it would be very elegant and dignified. Wolfing down their food and searching for seconds in the pot was something that unrefined barbarians would do. It was something that these noble and high-born gentlemen would never do. However, nobility, manners, elegance. Are those edible? Could those silly principles satisfy the hunger in their bellies? Of course not. Marquis Weiyuan and Lord Gu were childhood friends and had grown up together. When they had started studying, they had studied together in the Gu family's private school for their own clan members. Their mothers were best friends, so the two kids had practically grown up wearing the same pair of pants. However, at this moment, Marquis Weiyuan quickly finished off one of the sweet and sour pork ribs before staring at the remaining ribs on the plate. As he watched, Zheng reached out and stole away one more rib, so there was one left on that blue porcelain plate. Marquis Weiyuan immediately sent his chopsticks flying towards that last pork rib on the plate, but sparks flew as he suddenly met with another pair of silver chopsticks on his way. Marquis Weiyuan's gaze traced the chopsticks back to their owner, only to see the normally composed Lord Gu with his cheeks bulging. His eye twitched and he quickly spoke up, "Brother Gu, I touched it first, move your chopsticks away. Brotherly, I'm older than you by a year. When you were younger, I gave in to you all the time. This time, you should let your older brother have a turn. Brother Gu, your mouth is still full." Marquis Weiyuan and Lord Gu, who were practically twins since birth, had suddenly started arguing over a single sweet and sour pork rib. He-Changchi's awkwardness upon witnessing this scene didn't prevent him from continuously reaching out to grab some poached fish slices at all. It was good that they were arguing anyway. As a result, no one was fighting with him over this plate of fish. Although third sister-in-law had sent over an entire bowl the last time, it hadn't been enough. Furthermore, he had a big appetite, so he hadn't eaten his fill yet. This time, perhaps due to consideration for the guests, Chu Lian had prepared a much larger portion. That soft, tender, white meat was paired with the fiery fragrance of chili, yet it still melted in the mouth like butter. It was so tasty he even felt like swallowing his tongue along with it. Right after he had placed a thin slice of fish in his mouth, he caught sight of Xiao Bojian, who was sitting across from him, reaching into the large plate with a spoon. After some quick maneuvering with his chopsticks, when his spoon was lifted up from the sea of red chilies, it was full of tender, white fish slices. Following that, Changchi watched with wide eyes as Xiao Bojian poured all the fish slices into his small white porcelain bowl. Next, his empty spoon reached out once again towards the plate of poached fish. What the heck? What happened to their noblemen's gathering? There were only hungry ghosts sitting at this table. A meal that should have been filled with conversation, laughter and drink, ended in just an hour. Chapter 215, Lies, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. As Changchi looked at his friends holding their full bellies and leaning against their seats, burping with satisfaction, the corners of his mouth couldn't help but twitch. Luckily he had noticed that the situation was turning a little strange, so he had sent all the servants out of the room. Otherwise, if they had let their servants witness that battle just now, their servants would surely have thought that the whole group of gentlemen had been switched out for some impostors. They would likely have thought that the impostors must have been picked out from some beggars who hadn't eaten for days too. After he looked again at the empty plates and dishes on the table that had practically been licked clean, Changchi couldn't even be bothered to say anything. Once the hungry ghosts before him had rested for a while, Erjing slammed his palm on the table unhappily. Brother you're too selfish. We've always invited you to join us for meals and drinks. The food here is so delicious, how could you wait until today to invite us to your estate for a meal? Lord Guk shot a sideways glance at Changchi, whose expression was turning dark. When he thought back to Madame Zhou's actions just now, he realized that the situation was a little delicate. Changchi had also been wolfing down the food like he hadn't eaten in days. This was probably his first time eating such amazing cuisine too. Lord Gu didn't blame Changchi like Erjing did. He simply leaned against his chair without any consideration for his image while sipping at some old duck soup to satisfy his remaining cravings. He spoke with a little sourness in his tone. Sanlang's quite the lucky one. He deserves to go all the way to that terrible northern border. I pitied that brat at first, but now, I've lost all pity for him. If he were right here in front of me now, I'd tell him, you deserve it. Now that the sweet and sour pork ribs were all gone, Marquis Weiyuan and Lord Gu were the best of buds again. Poor Sanlang the Fair. After eating his fill, Xiao Bojian kept a low profile. His eyes were half shut and his long lashes hid the pools of emotion in his eyes. He pinched his left index finger with his right thumb and index finger. His thin lips were flushed red thanks to the spiciness of the fish from earlier. No one could see the dissatisfaction and resentment in his eyes. He remained as still as a statue. If Erjing wasn't familiar with his personality, he might have asked his senior brother about his mood. Xiao Bojian's eyes swept over Changchi, a hidden glint in their depths. All of this should have been his. Lianer personally cooking for him, praising Lianer's skills in front of his friends, Lianer helping him to manage the household. Facing each day as a couple, exchanging sweet nothings, supporting each other through the trials of life. Right after the group had just finished an unforgettable meal, a manservant entered the room with a wine gourd in hand. The manservant looked at the now empty dishes on the table with shock. He blinked a few times in disbelief before coming to his senses. He quickly walked over to Changchi's side and lowered his voice to ask, "Eldest young master, do you still want to serve this wine?" The manservant had gone to fetch the 10-year-old Yudonkan wine which Marquis Weiyuan had specially brought over. Who could have thought that the food would be completely decimated before the wine had even reached the table? Erjing looked around the group of gentlemen and said, "Just serve the wine." Marquis Weiyuan and Lord Gu nodded. They had already filled their bellies, so the wine wouldn't hurt them. Since they had had such a great meal, they were starting to have the interest to drink some wine. He Changchi nodded and ordered the manservant to call in 2 maidservants to clear out the empty dishes. He then had the main kitchen send out some food to have with the wine, so that they could all drink their fill. After tasting those amazing delicacies, they didn't have any appetite from looking at those normal dishes. They even felt a little depressed. The men had the feeling that their days were going to be rough from now on. As the saying went, it's easy for the frugal to become extravagant, but it's hard to reverse the process. After having such delectable gourmet food, it was going to be hard to swallow down their usual fare. With those thoughts in their head, all of them drank more than usual to drown out those depressing thoughts. The 10-year Yudonkan was considered one of the strongest spirits in the capital and packed a punch. Furthermore, the men couldn't bring themselves to eat the food that the main kitchen had sent over, so they ended up drinking even more. After an hour, even He Changchi, who usually had a great tolerance for alcohol, was drunk and incoherent, let alone the rest. When the manservant saw the state that the men were in, he could only order some servants to bring the gentlemen to rest in some rooms. The seemingly woozy Xiao Bojian was brought to a private room by an average-looking manservant. Once they were alone, those originally misty eyes abruptly awakened. His gaze was sober and calm, completely lacking any sign of his earlier drunkenness. The average-looking manservant, who was one in disguise, bowed to his master. "Master, you're not drunk." Xiao Bojian made a vague sound in reply before rubbing his temples. "Follow me to the inner court of the Jing'an estate. Leave 19 here to guard this place." TL note: I couldn't find any information about Yudonkan wine unfortunately. The author might have made it up for the story of W. Chapter 216, Taken Advantage of. 1. One's brows drew together and his lips parted in preparation to give voice to an objection. However, when he met with Xiao Bojian's icy gaze, he lowered his head and kept his thoughts to himself. It was just past 1 p.m., so most of the servants in the Jing'an estate's inner court had already gone to rest or slack about. On their way to the inner court, they didn't bump into anyone at all. After walking for a moment, Xiao Bojian pulled out a crude map from his sleeve. He looked down at it and checked his bearings before moving directly towards Songtao Court. One followed behind Xiao Bojian closely while watching his surroundings with caution. Chu Lian had finally managed to sneak in a half-day break at that waterside pavilion. She was lying in the pavilion having a nice afternoon nap right now. When a light breeze passed by, it brought along the mild fragrance of the chrysanthemums around them. When Xian saw that her master had fallen asleep, she gently placed a thin woven blanket over Chu Lian before carefully retreating to the zither room nearby. She sat herself at a table and worked on some embroidery as she guarded Chu Lian. Xiao Bojian entered Songtao Court through a small path in the garden and walked slowly while holding up the corner of his robe. It was already autumn, so the most of the flowers in the courtyard were withering, painting a yellow and bleak scene. Xiao Bojian's gaze swept over the arrangements of the courtyard as if memorizing them. In his mind, he was already thinking of building an even larger and even more exquisite estate for Chu Lian to live in, once she finally became his. As wild thoughts ran in his head, a flash of color at the corner of his vision caught his attention. His leisurely expression changed as his pupils contracted. He turned his head unconsciously and focused his gaze on that small splash of color. Not far away in the pavilion by the waterside, a girl wearing a simple light green dress laid sleeping on a wooden lounge chair. One arm was nested underneath her head, while the other was in the midst of slipping off the armrests. Her wide sleeves had slid down to her elbows, revealing her forearms. Her tender, white skin shone starkly against the dark-colored wooden armrests. Her slender little fingers were slightly opened and her small fingernails were unpainted, giving off a natural and cute impression. Xiao Bojian stood still, frozen to the spot, his gaze landing greedily on that woman's slim body. One looked at his master's expression and pressed his lips together. Despite his desire to speak, he suppressed his inner thoughts once again. Xiao Bojian's hands clenched into fists under his wide sleeves. After a short moment, he gave his orders in a low voice. 1. Take care of that handmaid over there. When he followed Xiao Bojian's line of sight, one noticed the handmaid working on some embroidery in the open zither room nearby. He cupped his fists in acknowledgement to his master before leaping into the air and disappearing from sight. In just a few minutes, Xian's body collapsed as she fainted. One then moved Xian to lie against one of the wooden supports in the zither room. When Xiao Bojian saw that one had finished his task, he strode towards the pavilion. Despite his calm outer appearance, his heart was beating like a drum. With every step he took that brought him closer to Chu Lian, his heart seemed to quicken a beat. When he entered the pavilion, he stopped by that sandalwood chair and looked upon the girl he had been thinking of day and night. His heartbeat paused for an instant, before pulsing ever faster, almost leaping out of his chest. He tilted his head downwards and took in the entirety of Chu Lian's appearance in his eyes. She was sound asleep, her hair scattered over the back of that lounge chair. Some loose strands were dancing along with the passing autumn breeze, inadvertently plucking at the strings of his heart. Chapter 217, Taken Advantage of. 2. The girl's eyes were closed, her thick eyelashes covering her lower eyelids like two small fans. Her fair skin and shapely nose were framed by the slight flush on her cheeks, her pink lips were parted slightly in her sleep. Chu Lian wasn't an unmatched beauty by any means, but she looked lovely and innocent when she was deep in sleep like this, like a little creature that needed protecting. As Xiao Bojian greedily devoured the enchanting scene with his eyes, he slowly bent down and reached out with his elegant fingers to touch the beauty before him. Right before his fingers were about to touch Chu Lian's soft cheeks, he curled his fingers back and retreated. In the end, he had to muster up all the reason he had to hold back from touching her face. However, he didn't pull his hand back, his fingers twitched slightly before tracing the curve of Chu Lian's profile. His finger glided over that lovely raised nose and passed over those parted petal-like lips, before sliding along the distinguished line of her chin and reaching her collarbones. His eyes followed the lines of her collarbones and went even further down, seemingly out of his control. The collar of her dress was made up of 2 lotus flowers and there was a light yellow piece of fabric peeking out from in between. The fabric below her collar was held up by the curves of her figure underneath. And even further down was her light green skirt. A cute little pair of shoes were exposed under the skirt. Xiao Bojian's eyes turned a little bloodshot and his breathing became heavier. He forced himself to pull his hand back and shifted his eyes back to Chu Lian's pretty little face instead. Chu Lian had been in the middle of a very comfortable nap. However, she suddenly felt a slight chill at her side, as if some danger had approached her body. Her brows drew together unconsciously and her mouth moved in her sleep. The tip of her tongue reached out a little from her mouth and glided along her pink lips. The originally innocent-looking girl had suddenly turned a little more seductive and charming thanks to this unconscious action. Chu Lian shifted in her sleep and pulled out the arm that had been under her head, turning to one side instead and gathering her arms together. Xiao Bojian had frozen to the spot when he noticed Chu Lian moving. When he realized that she hadn't woken up, he relaxed and let out a small sigh. However, as he watched her change poses, the primal urges that he had been suppressing surged up again, seemingly about to overwhelm his rational mind at any moment. Due to her movement, Chu Lian's collar had parted, and that light yellow fabric underneath was even more visible now. Furthermore, her new sideways pose meant that more of the fair white skin underneath her collar was now exposed. Xiao Bojian's mind had been blown apart by this scene. His restraint and reason vanished in the space of a second and he suddenly bent down, hands grabbing on the armrests of the sandalwood chair. To hell with patience and self-control. Lianer should have been his. If not for that Empress Dowager's decree, how could he have lost Lianer to House Jingon? How could she have become He Changdi's wife? He Changdi was at the northern border now, so who knew if he would even be able to return. Once he gathered enough power, he was going to erase He Changdi from the earth, without even a grave to mark his existence. While these hateful and painful thoughts passed through his mind, Xiao Bojian was already face to face with Chu Lian. Up close, Chu Lian's skin looked even more soft and tender, like the skin of a fresh peach. The warmth of her breath tickled his face. With eyes as deep as the ocean, he took in every little expression of hers with greedy eyes. Finally, he lowered his head and met the moist, pink lips before him with his own. Chapter 218, A Close Shave. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The soft feeling on his lips was like the headiest wine, leaving him drunk with emotions. He parted his lips a little more and even brought his tongue to play. With his restraint long lost, he slid a hand further downwards. While trapped in deep sleep, Chu Lian suddenly felt a chill all over her body. When she felt something cold touch her lips, she abruptly opened her eyes and was immediately met with that graceful, handsome face up close. Rage burst forth like a volcano in her mind, manifesting outwardly as a furious glare. Her first reaction was to bite down hard while her hands pushed with all her might at the person holding her down. Xiao Bojian was still immersed in his emotions and was caught off guard when Chu Lian pushed him. He couldn't catch his balance and retreated a few steps. It was only after that he felt the pain on his lips. His gaze darkened and he reached out to wipe his lower lip before bringing his fingers up to his eyes. His head was bent down as he looked at the streak of bright red blood on his hand. He then raised his head to stare at Chu Lian. "Lianer, it's me." It was him, it wasn't some stranger. How could Lianer treat him like that? Chu Lian was nauseous with disgust. She had already climbed off the lounge chair in her panic and retreated as far back as she could, all the way to the other side of the pavilion. Her brows were drawn tightly together as she glared at Xiao Bojian. She hadn't expected Xiao Bojian to be so shameless. How could he have taken advantage of her while she was asleep? Calling him a beast would be an insult to all animals. She was already married. How could he do something so immoral? In comparison, although her husband He Sanlang was a little crazy, he was still a proper gentleman. Furthermore, how had he come to the inner court of the Jing'an estate? In just a short moment, Chu Lian's mind was already filled with hundreds of thoughts and doubts. She realized that the main events in the original story hadn't changed their course despite her interference. However, many of the smaller details and events were already different. It seemed that she wouldn't be able to depend on the events she had read in the book to avoid disasters in the future. She had to make more thorough backup plans and preparations. Chu Lian furrowed her brows, eyes full of caution. "Mr. Xiao, why are you here?" If Chu Lian hadn't checked the surroundings and found out that there was no one around, she would have started shouting. She didn't want to stay around this dangerous man even a second longer. When Xiao Bojian noticed the caution in Chu Lian's eyes, a pang of pain pierced his heart. He quickly tried to explain, "Lianer, we haven't met in so long. I just wanted to see you." Only ghosts would believe that. "If you just wanted to see me, then why did you have to attack me?" Chu Lian didn't believe in Xiao Bojian's excuse one bit. Chu Lian pressed her lips together. She had caught sight of the unconscious Xian, who had somehow fainted against a pillar, in the zither room not too far away. When she connected it back to how Wenlan had fainted back in Defeng Tea House, she became even more vigilant. This was the inner court of the Jing'an estate. Although it was already after 1 p.m. and there weren't many servants about, if anyone happened across this situation, she wouldn't be able to clear her name no matter what. Although the Great Wu dynasty was more open-minded, women would always be on the losing end of things. Furthermore, she was a newlywed wife whose husband wasn't at home. It would be hard for anyone not to suspect her of consorting with another man. Since you've already seen me, it's about time for you to leave, Mr. Xiao. Chu Lian tried her best to use a level tone to speak. Although Xiao Bojian wasn't very strong himself, he had a skilled bodyguard. This was something that the original novel had mentioned. Thus, despite how frustrated Chu Lian was, she did her best to control her rage. She was afraid that Xiao Bojian would lose his rationality and call out his bodyguard to attack her if she provoked and angered him. Her few paltry self-defense skills were nothing in front of a skilled martial artist like that. Xiao Bojian's long and narrow eyes were focused tightly on the frightened girl before him. His arms were placed behind his back, hiding the fists that were clenched from exerting every bit of his self-control. Lianer, didn't you miss me at all? I know I was in the wrong for leaving you behind that day. I'm a bastard. I've been sunken in my guilt for all these days. Lianer, you have to believe me. Can you believe me in just this once? If something like that day happens again, I won't ever abandon you again, even if my life is in danger. I'll keep you by my side always and protect you. You'll never suffer a single bit of hurt ever more. Xiao Bojian's voice was brimming with emotion as he spoke. Coupled together with that beautiful metrosexual face of his, it could probably convince any naive and sheltered young ladies in seconds. If she were the original Chu Lian, perhaps she would have been touched enough to run into his embrace. However, what a pity for him. Chu Lian was no longer the original Chu Lian. She wasn't the slightest bit touched. Conversely, she was disgusted beyond belief. Chu Lian didn't even try to discern if Xiao Bojian had any bit of sincerity in his words. She only thought it laughable. She finally realized why she didn't have any feelings for Xiao Bojian even though she had taken over the body of the female lead, his supposed lover, in the story. This man was full of ambition and had the silver tongue to match. Before actual danger approached, he could promise anything he wanted. However, if he were really sincere about protecting her, he should have just shown it with his actions before making the promise. Since he had already abandoned her once, he shouldn't have come back so shamelessly, much less trying to make up for it. Chapter 219, A Close Shave, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian thought once again that He Changdi was much better than Xiao Bojian. At least that man would show his sincerity through his actions, rather than just using meaningless words. She sneered inwardly. Did Xiao Bojian really think that those empty promises would melt her heart? That only showed how much he didn't understand her. Mr. Xiao, don't you know that you're causing trouble for me like this? Right now, I don't have any ties with you at all. Chu Lian lowered her head as she spoke, hiding the annoyance and disgust in her eyes from Xiao Bojian. Xiao Bojian stiffened and looked around anxiously. This place was foreign to him, it was the Jing'an estate, and the woman before him had the title of House Jing'an's third young madam. When his thoughts led him to this realization, it was as if he had lost his soul. He felt as if thorns were piercing him right through the heart. That's right. How could he have forgotten that fact? Such a wonderful and perfect Lianer didn't belong to him right now. The depths of his eyes instantly chilled over, but the guilt in his heart only increased. He took a deep breath and managed to calm down a little. He raised his gaze and stared at Chu Lian. Lianer, I didn't think things through carefully enough. But don't worry, I'll get you out of this and give you a proper title as my wife. You have to wait for me. It won't take too long. Chu Lian was inwardly shocked by his admission, but she didn't dare to display it on her face. She looked downwards without speaking, as if she was pretending to be angry at him. It was clear from Xiao Bojian's expression that he couldn't bear to part with her. However, he pressed his lips together and finally said, "Lianer, don't be angry with me. I'm leaving now, rest assured, we won't be discovered." After saying so, he strode right out of the pavilion. After stepping out, Xiao Bojian paused before adding on, "Lianer, the meal you cooked today was delicious. In the future, would you cook for just me alone?" Unfortunately, he didn't have the right to say that now. Perhaps Xiao Bojian was really feeling shame and remorse. He didn't even turn back to look at her again after leaving. It wasn't until Xiao Bojian's figure had completely disappeared from sight that Chu Lian dared to raise her head. Her remaining strength left her body and she collapsed on the spot. That was way too dangerous. If she hadn't discovered Xiao Bojian's guilt towards her in time, their meeting wouldn't have ended well for her. If that Xiao Bojian could act so fearlessly even in the Jing'an estate, it looked like just avoiding him wasn't going to work next time. She had to prepare some precautionary measures somehow. Sob sob. She really didn't like him at all. If she could pay 1,000 taels to stop Xiao Bojian from liking her, she would have gritted her teeth and paid out the full amount. Why was she so unlucky? Chu Lian wiped her lips fiercely with a handkerchief until they were red and sore. Then, she threw the offending handkerchief to the ground in a temper. Xiao Bojian's thin lips looked so soft, pink, and weak. They were pretty much better looking than hers. Wasn't his kiss basically the same as getting kissed by a woman? Chu Lian flipped a table in her mind. She wasn't the type of person who dwelled on things. For the whole incident today, she just treated it as getting bitten by a passing stray dog. Thus, she managed to calm herself down and walked over to Xian to wake her up. When she took a look at the back of Xian's neck, there was a bruise, just like the previous time with Wenlan. After Xian woke up, she was completely panic-stricken. "Third young madam, are you well?" Chu Lian shook her head and helped her up from the floor. "I'm fine." Xian looked Chu Lian up and down. When she saw that her master really seemed okay, she heaved a sigh of relief. Her voice trembled as she asked, "Was it Mr. Xiao?" Chu Lian knew that she couldn't hide this matter from Xian, so she nodded. Xian's cheeks immediately puffed up, shaking with anger as she said, "He. How dare he? This is the Jing'an estate." Chu Lian was also helpless. Xiao Bojian was indeed very bold. If she hadn't made use of his guilt towards her today, he probably wouldn't have left so quickly. When Xian noticed Chu Lian's silence, she quickly tried to reassure her. "Third young madam, please don't worry too much. As long as we don't associate with him, he can't do anything to third young madam." Chu Lian couldn't be bothered to say any more on the matter. She had already lost the interest to nap by this time. She simply ordered listlessly, "Let's return to our courtyard." Xian answered her and quickly followed behind third young madam. However, she had already decided in her heart to send Wenqing and Wenlan with her master, no matter where she went. While full of suppressed emotion, Xiao Bojian quickly strode along. Since Xiao Bojian had left that pavilion, one had already come out of the shadows to follow behind his master. He kept a watchful eye on their surroundings as they left the inner court of the Jing'an estate. Along the way, he even knocked out 2 servants who had been passing through the gardens. No matter how skilled he was in martial arts, he couldn't make any careless mistakes while protecting his master. Just as Xiao Bojian was passing through the door connecting the outer and inner courts, he was caught by someone's gaze. Madame Zhou couldn't stop worrying when she wasn't serving by her husband's side. When she heard that her husband's friends had been sent to rest after getting drunk, she had gone to the outer court to check on the situation. However, on her way back to the inner court, she suddenly spotted a familiar figure. Xiao Bojian's appearance was rather outstanding and would attract a second look from anyone, regardless of gender. No matter how much he tried to keep a low profile with his dressing and personality, he couldn't hide his extraordinary looks. TL note, the author put the table flip emoji there, so I kept it in the text. Chapter 220, Who Else to Target? 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Today, Xiao Bojian was dressed in a dark green round-collared robe with a matching green belt tie around his waist. Other than a simple square piece of jade, he hadn't hung anything on his belt, let alone a small pouch for some accessories. Although he was dressed in such a low-key color, to the point that it could even act as camouflage, his broad shoulders and narrow waist carried the robe well and made him stand out instead. Under his round collar, there was an inner piece of fabric that extended beyond the collar and wrapped around his throat, giving him an air of restraint. He Changqi's close friends were rather good-looking and they all came from distinguished family backgrounds. Thus, their temperaments and dressing stood out above most. However, when they stood next to Xiao Bojian, they paled in comparison and became foils to his handsomeness instead. Thus, Xiao Bojian had given Madame Zhou a very deep impression from just that short period at the small gathering today. The moment she caught sight of his back, she could tell who it was. Although Xiao Bojian wasn't really well known amongst the social circles of the nobility in the capital, he did have some fame in the Imperial College. Even Madame Zhou had heard of Xiao Bojian once or twice before. Her gaze was stuck on Xiao Bojian's back until he vanished through that connecting door. Next, she traced the small path he had taken with her eyes and she realized what lay in that direction. At the end of the small path that Xiao Bojian had just taken, was Songtao Court. Suddenly, all sorts of thoughts flared up in Madame Zhou's head. In a short moment, she clenched her fists in excitement. By the time Zheng and the rest had woken up from their drunken stupors, they attempted to stay in the Jing'an estate for dinner. When he thought back to those new delicacies he had eaten at lunch, Zheng even wanted to badger He Changqi to let him stay over at the Jing'an estate for some time. Sob sob sob. That damned He Sanlang was way too lucky. Why did the heavens bestow him with such a virtuous wife who could cook so well? I can't go on like this. I have to get grandmother to send someone to housing to check if they have any single ladies to wed when I get home. He Changqi didn't know how to react. These friends of his. Normally, he'd have to invite them a few times before they would come over. However, now they were trying to drag out their stay and were even refusing to leave. Did they have to be so shameless? He Changqi was a little troubled. If these dishes had been made by his own wife, then he would have just treated them to one meal. However, it was third sister-in-law who had cooked the meal. He wasn't so shameless as to trouble her again. Isn't that enough for today? Did you forget your manners? My sister-in-law isn't a cook at your beck and call. Marquis Weiyuan complained with a cry of, "Brother, he's being petty." However, they were all gentlemen, so they understood the rationale behind He Changqi's statement. As much as they really wanted to have another meal, they could only stop with their requests. Each of them sighed with laments. They suspected that they wouldn't be able to eat anything else when they returned home to their estates. He Changqi was rather helpless upon seeing the situation like this. He suddenly recalled something that his grandmother had mentioned offhand to him while chatting the other day. He then called out to the men who were on their way out, "If you really want to eat third sister-in-law's cooking again, you can wait until Gillen restaurant opens again." Grandmother gave her Gillen restaurant over to third sister-in-law to manage, so it shouldn't be too long before it reopens. Really? Honored Lady Jeannie is going to run a restaurant. The three of them were overjoyed. Since Chu Lian was going to open a restaurant, it was definitely going to have some specialties. Thus, if they craved for those delicious foods in the future, they wouldn't need to throw away their dignity to beg He Changqi for a meal then. I'll definitely let all of you know when third sister-in-law's restaurant reopens. With this news in mind, the group returned home in high spirits. The next day, Chu Lian brought Wenqing and Wenlan along with her to Gillen Restaurant again. She passed on some instructions regarding the restaurant's renovations before rushing home. The renovations were almost done. She had chosen a chef from one of the servants who had followed her from Hao Xing when she had gotten married. The novel had mentioned this person before. He was a loyal servant, and the original, Chu Lian, had frequently used him to send letters out to Xiao Bojian. Mao Zhangji's parents were still alive and well, and they were all servants under Chu Lian's name. He was 18 this year. His father used to be a third-rank cook in Hao Xing, so he had learned some culinary skills from his father at a young age. He did have some talent in cooking. Chu Lian had never kept her handmaids and senior servants away while she was cooking. Xian was meticulous and had learned how to cook quite a few dishes from her, so Chu Lian sent her to teach Mao Zhangji how to make the specialties for Gillen Restaurant. From Xian's report, Mao Zhangji had already managed to learn most of them. He was even better at cooking some of the dishes compared to his temporary teacher, Xian. Last night, she had specially ordered Mao Zhangji to cook dinner for Songtao Court. After tasting his handiwork, Chu Lian was pleased. The bookkeeping was still left to Gillen Restaurant's old bookkeeper Wang. As for the manager, she let Manager Qin, the manager she had temporarily borrowed from Matriarch He, take up the post. In the past few days, the 30-something Manager Qin had been very diligent and conscientious in his work for her. What was even more rare was that he wasn't stuck in old ways and was open to new ideas. He was also quite smooth when it came to talking business. He was the third son of Matriarch He's main steward. The matriarch had been thinking of training him to become a main steward at first, but she had specially sent Manager Qin over due to her love for Chu Lian. Thus, his abilities were definitely top-notch. After some discussion, Chu Lian and Matriarch He had decided that the 1st of September was a good day. Thus, the reopening of Gillen Restaurant was set to be on that date. Chu Lian had already prepared gold-embossed invitations to be sent out. All she had to do next was to decide who to invite. Chapter 221, Who Else to Target? 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Both Matriarch He and the servants in Chu Lian's courtyard were looking forward to Gillen Restaurant's reopening. Gillen Restaurant held a special place in Matriarch He's heart. As for the third branch, the restaurant was going to be a very important source of income for them. He Sanlang had ventured out to the northern border by himself. Who knew when he would be able to return to this courtyard? Third young madam was all alone in the estate and her dowry was rather pitiful. She also wasn't in line to manage the estate. The expenses of their branch were paid from the estate's shared accounts, but they still had to have some personal funds to use freely. Otherwise, they would definitely be looked down upon by others. Back in the Ying estate, she was just a young miss, so it was fine if she didn't have much money of her own. However, Chu Lian was now the lady in charge of the third branch, so she had to have some funds squared away. Furthermore, third young madam wasn't miserly. If she got rich one day, she would naturally award her servants richly as well. Thus, from senior servants Gue and Zhong to the menial servants sweeping the floors in the courtyard, all of them were hoping that third young madam's Gillen Restaurant would do well and prosper. In the end, Chu Lian turned out to be the most relaxed person in the estate. She just ate, drank and slept all day, enjoying what little pleasures she could. Gillen Restaurant's reopening seemed to be an event as ordinary as her daily calligraphy practice to her. As the date of the reopening drew closer, even Xian started to get anxious. However, her master was just lying on a lounge chair and eating some candied fruits while casually flipping through a newly published comedy book. Looking at her master's overly relaxed appearance, Xian didn't know whether to complain or relax along with Chu Lian. She walked over to Chu Lien with a few different types of fabric in hand. Third young madam, which color should we use for the drapes in the private rooms? When Chu Lien heard Xian's words, she didn't even look up. She was in the middle of an exciting part of her book. You can decide that yourself, you don't have to come to me for these small matters. If she had to be consulted for details as small as the colors of the drapes, wouldn't she be overwhelmed with work in the future when she had more stores in hand? She was reopening Gillen Restaurant so that she could earn more money and enjoy life, not to create more troubles and work for herself. Her final goal was to become a carefree and relaxed layabout. Xian felt a little helpless, but she knew that third young madam's words were the law. Thus, she quietly picked out a color that she liked. However, she didn't leave after that and continued talking. Third young madam, should we train 2 more loyal cooks? Chu Lien finally looked up from her book and turned to Xian. Why do you say that? Seeing that third young madam was finally paying attention to her, Xian got a little excited. Third young madam, have you seen those large restaurants in the capital? They're always so full to the point that there aren't any empty seats. The restaurants with some unique specialties usually have a long queue outside. How will Cook Mao be able to manage everything alone? Won't he be overworked? After hearing Xian's words, Chu Lien smiled and put down her book. She then took up a teacup from the table next to her and sipped some honey water. Xian, you're overthinking things. I'm planning to have only about 20 tables of guests each day. Xian's eyes widened in shock and she said in disbelief, Third young madam, didn't you say that you were going to make Gillen Restaurant famed throughout the capital and defeat the Yuehong Restaurant on Zhuke Avenue? With just around 20 tables of guests a day, how were they going to win Yuehong Restaurant? Just the amount of income daily was definitely not going to be enough to support the restaurant's expenses. After seeing Xian's astonishment, Chu Lien couldn't resist the urge to chuckle. She looked just like a cute little white fox whose tricks had finally succeeded. Silly girl. I'll give you an example. If there was a set of armor that could protect your whole body and there was only one like it in the whole world, then it would be a one-of-a-kind treasure. All the warriors in the world would definitely pit their lives to win it. If there were 10 sets of this armor, then it could be called a rarity. If there were suddenly 10,000 sets of it, there would be enough to outfit every single member of the city guards. Then this armor would no longer be a treasure, and it would simply be some common rubbish. Xian wasn't slow. After getting Chu Lien's guidance, it was as if she had woken up from a dream. Actually, this was very simple common sense. Everyone knew that the value of things was pegged to their rarity. Otherwise, why would Hitian jade be something that even money couldn't buy? The easier it was to get something, the less people would treasure it. This applied to third young madam's secret recipes as well. As long as the restaurant built up a good reputation and kept its services rare, it would definitely attract the nobility of the capital, to the point that they might even fight over it. By then, even if they set the cost to reserve a single table as 100 taels, there would still be buyers lining up with cash in hand. The difference between earning 100 taels from 100 tables versus earning 100 taels from a single table was like heaven and earth. Chu Lien's eyes sparkled as she looked at Xian. Do you understand now? Xian's expression had also turned to joy. She stared at her master with admiration, just so happening to look like a loyal little puppy. Chu Lien smiled. This was what she had planned from the moment she had decided to reopen Gillen Restaurant. Who had the most money to spend in the Great Wu Dynasty? It was the nobility, of course. She was a madam of House Jing'an and also held the title of Honored Lady Genie now. She was starting off with an advantage and she didn't need to fear some nobles trying to use their status to take advantage of her business. Furthermore, she would feel more at peace with herself if she targeted the nobles. The purses of those distinguished houses were all stuffed full of money. Who else would she target if not them? If she had to go against her conscience and target the commoners who earned their money with blood, sweat and tears, she wouldn't be able to do it. After another day passed, Chu Lian made her preparations early in the morning and went over to Qingxi Hall. Today, she was to accompany Matriarch He to make a visit to the Jing estate. They had just gotten ready and were about to head over to the outer court to board the carriage when a steward came over to report that House Sheng had sent someone over. Matriarch He quickly ordered the servants to guide the person from House Sheng into Qingxi Hall. It was the main steward of the Jing estate who had come. The moment he entered, he fell to the ground on his knees and knelt before Matriarch He. Matriarch He, please allow honored Lady Jeannie to save our old Duke Sheng. Chapter 222, Old Gourmet, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian stared with eyes wide open in shock. Had this steward gotten her mixed up with someone else? Please, she wasn't a doctor and she didn't know how to treat people. She didn't have any miraculous cure-all either. How was she supposed to save old Duke Sheng? Matriarch He was also confused. However, the steward kneeling at her feet didn't seem to be lying. The anxiety and grief in his expression wasn't something that could be faked so easily. What's going on? Sanlang's wife doesn't know medicine. How can she save old Duke Sheng? Upon hearing Matriarch He's questions, House Sheng's steward blushed for an instant. However, he couldn't hide the truth anyway, so he explained the circumstances in full to Matriarch He and Chu Lian. Even when Chu Lian had already boarded House Sheng's carriage, she was still a little dizzy from the sudden turn of events. What a strange predicament this was. Who could have expected that old Duke Sheng's illness had been caused by the lack of gourmet dishes that fit his exacting tastes? No wonder House Sheng had kept this matter sealed up so tightly. The explanation they gave to outsiders was that old Duke Sheng was getting on in age and his health was declining to the point that he was bedridden. If the social circles of the nobility were to find out that old Duke Sheng had stopped eating due to his pickiness over food and that it had caused the decline in his health, wouldn't they laugh until their faces cramped up? House Sheng would also become the laughingstock of the capital if that were to happen. The corners of Chu Lian's mouth twitched. This old Duke Sheng had really contracted a very strange illness. Chu Lian also finally understood why old Duchess Sheng had been so anxious to invite her to their estate. Luckily, Chu Lian wasn't a cold-hearted person. Since they had come to her for help due to the circumstances, she was happy to oblige. As the saying goes, there is more merit in saving a person's life than in building a 7-story pagoda. Furthermore, the person in need here was old Duke Sheng, who had a good reputation in the capital. However, she couldn't make an empty promise. She had only told House Sheng's steward that she would try her best. Even so, that steward had thanked her profusely, as if he had finally found the help they needed. While watching Chu Lian's actions, Matriarch He had given a nod of approval inwardly. Sanlang's wife was kind but not too soft. She knew her own limits and hadn't tried to show off her skills. Although she was a little lazy normally, when it came to major events, she was good at keeping the situation under control. On the way to the Jing estate, Chu Lian hadn't been idle. She started by asking the steward what old Duke Sheng liked to eat, before asking after his physical health. After thinking it over in her mind, she started forming an initial list of dishes to make. Once the steward got honored Lady Jeannie's instructions, he immediately ordered one of the manservants in their party to rush back to the estate to prepare the ingredients that honored Lady Jeannie required. Matriarch He and Chu Lian finally reached the Jing estate after half an hour. They got off the carriage at the side gate of the estate and were led into the inner court by old Duchess Sheng herself. They then entered old Duke Sheng's bedroom. When Sheng returned to the estate, he noticed a few carriages parked outside the side gate and one of the estate's grooms taking care of the horses. Xiao Bojian dismounted from his horse and looked carefully at the carriages. He spoke his observations in a baffled tone. Tiancheng, those seem to be House Jing'an's carriages. Zhang looked more closely at the symbols on the carriage and agreed. The heir only knew that his grandfather's health was failing, but his parents hadn't told him the reason for his grandfather's illness. Thus, Zhang was still in the dark about the situation. He shot a glance at his manservant. The quick-witted manservant got the message and quickly went over to inquire about the carriages. In a short moment's time, he returned and whispered something into Zhang's ear. Zhang's expression turned into one of surprise. Brother Xiao, House Jing'an's matriarch and honored Lady Jeannie have come to visit my estate. Xiao Bojian was also a little surprised. At the same time, a sweet feeling suffused his heart. See, he and Lianer were still connected by fate. He had even bumped into her here at the Jing estate. Chapter 223, Old Gourmet, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Honored Lady Jeannie's delicious cooking was still fresh in Zhang's mind. Unfortunately, his grandfather's health had been declining day by day recently, so he wasn't in the mood to think about food. However, since honored Lady Jeannie had specially prepared those dishes for them that day, he decided to thank her personally if he happened to meet her in the inner court. A glint flashed in Xiao Bojian's eyes, but he didn't say anything. However, he had already formed a plan inwardly. Although Xiao Bojian was good friends with Zhang, he was still an outsider and a male at that. It wasn't appropriate for him to enter the inner court of the Jing estate. He regularly came to the Jing estate as a guest, but he rarely set foot into the inner court. He would usually follow Zhang to his study in the outer court. Today was no exception. Old Duchess Xing had already been waiting at the entrance of her courtyard. Once she caught sight of Matriarch He and Chu Lian, she immediately stepped forward in welcome. When she was within arm's reach, she grasped Matriarch He's hands with tears in her eyes. Old sister, you've finally come. Matriarch He patted her hand and reassured her, you don't have to stand on courtesy with us. Let's go in to see old Duke Xing first. Do tell Sanlang's wife if there's anything that old Duke Xing can't eat. Old Duchess Xing wiped away her tears and nodded. Following that, she led Chu Lian and Matriarch He into the bedroom. Old Duke Xing was indeed quite ill. He seemed to be sleeping in a lethargic state and was in the midst of dreaming. He was even mumbling something unintelligible. However, he barely had any strength and his voice was so soft that Chu Lian had to move right next to him before she could hear what he was saying. The moment she could finally make something out, she didn't know how to react. Old Duke Xing was already 1 foot in the coffin, but even in his dreams, he was mumbling, oranges. Crabs, how much of a gourmet was this old Duke Xing? Chu Lian didn't know how to check pulses, let alone anything to do with traditional Chinese medicine. There was still an imperial physician checking on old Duke Sheng's pulse next to his bed, so Chu Lian asked the physician what foods the old duke had to avoid in his condition. When she finally had a good understanding of what he couldn't eat, she led Xian and Mingyan over to the small kitchen that the Jing estate had already prepared in advance. The kitchen was outfitted with plenty of fresh ingredients. Some had even been sent in not too long ago after Chu Lian's instructions on the way here. It was the middle of autumn now, so it was just the time when crabs would be meaty and tasty. It was also the time when oranges ripened, so no wonder the old gourmet duke would be thinking of those 2 foods even in his sleep. Since he clearly wanted to eat those, Chu Lian already knew what to do. How about some stuffed orange with crab meat? Just like how you had to have the right medicine to cure a certain illness, you had to make sure the right dish matched the cravings of the diner. Stuffed orange with crab meat wasn't hard to make. They just had to pick some good, fresh oranges and a fat crab. They did have crab here in this kitchen, but they didn't have any oranges here. She ordered Xian to notify the servant waiting outside to find her some quality oranges. It was the season for oranges, so they shouldn't be too hard to find. The senior servant then brought 2 maidservants with her and quickly headed off to the outer court to find the steward in charge of buying ingredients. Chu Lian prepared the crab herself, digging out the meat within the shell and giving instructions to Xian by her side. Ming Yan was sent off to cook some ginseng porridge. The crabs were ready in a short moment. By then, the senior servant had already returned with the fresh oranges that Chu Lian needed. The oranges were brightly colored and fragrant with a nice, even shape. At one look, you could tell that they were quality oranges. They had to cut open the oranges, remove the contents within and then pack it with stuffing made of crab meat, pork, water chestnuts, ground ginger and rice wine. After covering it back up with the cap they cut off the top, they had to put it on a steamer basket and steam it. TL note, sounds weird, but interesting. Wonder what it tastes like. Stuffed orange with crab meat, fancier version for old Duke Sheng. Chapter 224, Old Gourmet, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The servant who had brought the ingredients didn't dare to stay in the kitchen and watch. She lowered her head and led the other maidservants out and took her post by the kitchen entrance again. Xian washed the oranges before passing them to Chu Lian. In order to make them look more appetizing, Chu Lian carefully carved out some simple patterns on the skins of the fruits. After that, she cut them open. When it came to the 3rd orange, as she slid the knife into the orange, it was suddenly blocked by something within. Chu Lian frowned and pulled the orange apart. Somehow, there was a thin iron capsule within. Xian's eyes widened and her face was filled with shock. Conversely, Chu Lian had only paused for a moment before calming down. She shot a glance at Xian before looking at Ming Yan, who was busy cooking porridge at the stove, indicating that Xian had to stay quiet. Chu Lian quickly pulled out that thin iron capsule with her nimble fingers. She found the mechanism that kept it closed and activated it, opening the capsule with a quiet click. Inside was a small roll of paper. As for why Chu Lian was so familiar with the capsule's mechanism, she had read it in the original novel before. Xiao Bojian liked to send messages to Chu Lian in this manner. He had used these kinds of iron capsules previously. Before she even opened the paper roll, Chu Lian noticed a small Xiao written on the outside. As expected, this was a message from Xiao Bojian. That Xiao Bojian was still this delusional. He still thought that she liked him and refused to go away. Rage surfaced in Chu Lian's heart. She immediately lost all interest in the note's contents. In front of Xian, she threw the unopened note and capsule into the fire of the stove. Sparks flew from the roaring fire, turning the note into ashes. When Xian saw Chu Lian's actions with her own eyes, a sense of relief came over her heart. She knew that her master didn't have any feelings for Mr. Xiao at all. Her master's decision was right. She was House Jing'an's 3rd young madam now. Even though she wasn't the lady in charge of the main branch, she was still the mistress of the 3rd branch. She also had the title of Honored Lady Genie now. Even if she didn't want to fight for more status and power, she still had to uphold her responsibility and reputation. Furthermore, other than leaving for the northern border, young master hadn't let down 3rd young madam in any other way. Even without including 3rd young master's handsome looks, just based on the He family's rules, it was a house worthy of 3rd young madam's efforts to protect it. For a noble lady who married into a distinguished house, it was quite rare that they didn't have to face an inner court full of their husbands' concubines. Just based on that alone, it was worth the effort for 3rd young madam to keep her reputation clean. Furthermore, He Sanlang had a good family background and was so much better than Mr. Xiao. It was all that Mr. Xiao's fault. Their young miss had already married someone else. Why was he still latching on to her like a leech and refusing to let go? She invented her hatred on Xiao Bojian in her heart. The originally kind and gentle handmaid was now questioning Xiao Bojian's ancestors in her mind about the wretch their family had given birth to. Chu Lian glanced at Shi Yan and instructed her in a calm tone. You never saw that. Shi Yan nodded in acknowledgement. After that, Chu Lian continued preparing the oranges as if nothing had happened. 2 hours later, the warming and nourishing ginseng porridge as well as the fragrant stuffed orange with crab meat were both done. Chu Lian then specially cooked up 2 side dishes with her own hands. Old Duke Zheng had been bedridden for a long time and had stopped eating for quite a few days. He couldn't eat anything hard. Thus, she had picked out some foods with softer textures for him. Chu Lian cleaned up a little before having her maidservants carry the food in some food containers. They then rushed back to old Duke Zheng's bedroom. Back in the Jing estate's outer court, Xiao Bojian was left alone in the study. Zheng had already rushed off to the inner court. There was a vast collection of books in the Jing estate study, so Xiao Bojian came over regularly to borrow books. At this moment, the secret guard one was whispering into Xiao Bojian's ear while disguised as a manservant. Xiao Bojian frowned. His tone carried a trace of anger as he spoke. What? She threw the note into the fire without looking at it. One stood respectfully at one side and nodded. Rage rose like a wave in Xiao Bojian's chest. He leaned against the boxwood chair with his eyes shut for a long moment before managing to calm himself down again. Lianer. How could you be so silly? Why don't you trust me? Do you know what I wrote in that note? Bitterness and helplessness were mixed in Xiao Bojian's thoughts. He really wanted to grab that annoying woman and bully her a little to vent his frustrations. TL note, I'll be off on holiday for the next 6 days. If there are any typos, please comment below the chapters and I'll fix them when I get back. Chapter 225, Keeping Her Behind. 1. This time, Xiao Bojian had actually sent a proper message for once. What he had written on that note wasn't flowery professions of love, but he had cried wolf too many times, so no wonder Chu Lian didn't even want to look at it. The contents of that note were related to Chu Lian's father. Through some sheer luck, the normally idle second master of housing, Chu Qizheng, had somehow gotten a proper 5th-ranked position that was actually just a cushy job. Not only that, but he seemed to have gotten connected to the Pan estate somehow. There was definitely something up considering how abnormal this situation was. Xiao Bojian had just wanted to inform Chu Lian of this news and ask if she had any idea what was going on. Unfortunately, that little paper note had already gone up in flames. When Xiao Bojian noticed that his fists had clenched at some point, he realized that he was starting to lose his patience. The autumn examinations. This year, no one was going to stop him. He had borne with so much for 10 years, all for the sake of finally showing off his brilliance in court. He was definitely going to become the person standing at that peak. Chu Lian led her maidservants into old Duke Zheng's bedroom. At this moment, old Duchess Zheng and Matriarch He were both waiting for her in the outer room. When she heard someone report that Chu Lian had come back with the food, old Duchess Zheng couldn't sit still any longer and she quickly stood up. Matriarch He gently reassured her, "Don't worry, this old woman has faith in the cooking skills of Sanlang's wife." Chu Lian was actually more anxious than the 2 elderly women. She even had a little doubt in her heart. Was old Duke Zheng really going to be cured with just a tasty meal? She was led to old Duke Zheng's bedside. Some maidservants had already set up a small table next to the bed. Chu Lian took the box of food from Zion's hands and personally arranged the dishes one by one on the small table. Chu Lian glanced at the unconscious old Duke Zheng and frowned. Her shiny black eyes darted about in thought before she spoke up in a soft and gentle tone. A superior man possesses extraordinary comprehension and intellect. His excellence within is displayed through his posture and actions without. To seek enlightenment from crabs, today we have offered up some crab and orange. The cool of mid-autumn is when the taste of crabs and oranges are at their best. No wonder old Duke Xing has them in his thoughts. However, as a gourmand, old Duke Xing surely must have eaten many fresh crabs and quality oranges before. However, have you ever tried eating crabs and oranges together? This junior has a secret recipe here called stuffed orange with crab meat. With this method of cooking, you could say that the fragrance of oranges and the freshness of the crab have both been expressed fully. Fresh and fragrant, paired with 5 other types of seasonings. If you're not able to taste it in this life, then it would truly be a regret. While Chu Lian was describing the dish, she even opened up one of the stuffed oranges. The originally sealed aroma instantly drifted through the air and filled the room. The whole room was now brimming with a smell that was as fresh and fragrant as Chu Lian had described. Furthermore, her speech was so tempting that even old Duchess Shang and matriarchy, as well as the imperial physician waiting on the side, had all secretly sniffed at the air and gulped down some saliva. Of course, this also had an effect on the bedridden old duke. Old Duke Sheng had still been in the midst of unconsciousness. Suddenly, his eyelids twitched and he opened up his wrinkled old eyes. Although his pupils seemed a little misty at first, they quickly turned sharper. His nose wrinkled up, as if detecting the smell of good food in the air. When he finally distinguished what that aroma was made of, his old eyes shone brightly. He struggled to sit up, shouting with a hoarse voice, quickly. Help me up. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.